July 31st, 1715. 2 o'clock in the morning. Off the coast of Florida, 11 ships carrying the wealth of an empire vanish into a hurricane's fury. Over 1,000 souls swallowed by the Atlantic in a single night. But here's what the Spanish crown never anticipated. When dawn broke over the wreckage-strewn beaches of Florida, word of this catastrophe would travel faster than any royal decree. From the taverns of Jamaica to the docks of Nassau, men who had once served kings would hear opportunity calling. The 1715 treasure fleet disaster didn't just sink ships. It launched the most notorious era of piracy the world has ever known. Tonight, we uncover how a single storm transformed desperate sailors into legends whose names still echo across centuries. To understand how 11 ships changed the course of history, we must first step back to a world where empires rose and fell on the strength of their navies, and where the line between patriot and pirate was thinner than a cutlass blade. The year is 1714. After 13 years of brutal warfare, the War of Spanish Succession has finally ended. Across the Caribbean, thousands of English privateers who had spent over a decade legally plundering Spanish vessels for king and country suddenly found themselves unemployed. Picture this: battle-hardened sailors who knew every reef and current from Tortuga to Trinidad, men who could navigate by stars and fight with the fury of cornered wolves, now had no legal way to use their skills. The Royal Navy was cutting back. Merchant captains paid poorly and treated crews like slaves. But Spain? Spain was hemorrhaging gold. For 2 centuries, Spanish treasure fleets had ferried the wealth of the New World back to Madrid. Silver from Potosi, gold from Mexico, emerald from Colombia, fortunes that built cathedrals and funded wars. These convoys followed predictable routes, carried astronomical wealth, and were protected by naval escort that, frankly, hadn't been tested against determined pirates in decades. The Spanish had grown comfortable, perhaps too comfortable. Captain Henry Jennings knew this better than most. A Jamaican privateer with his own estate and a reputation for calculated aggression, Jennings had spent the war years attacking Spanish shipping under letters of marque, government licenses that made piracy legal as long as you targeted the right flags. When peace was declared, men like Jennings faced a choice: return to mundane merchant work or continue doing what they did best without the paperwork. Then came July 31st, 1715. General Juan Esteban de Ubilla commanded the most valuable treasure fleet Spain had assembled in years. 11 ships carrying 2 years' worth of accumulated wealth from the Americas, silver ingots, gold doubloons, precious stones, and those legendary pieces of 8 that will become the currency of pirate dreams. The fleet had departed Havana on July 24th, following the well-traveled route that hugged Florida's coast before turning east toward Spain. For 6 days, they made steady progress through calm seas under summer skies. At 2 in the morning on July 31st, nature intervened with devastating precision. The hurricane struck with such ferocity that within hours, 10 of the 11 ships in the convoy were destroyed. 2 vanished completely into the open ocean. 8 others were driven into the shallow waters off Florida's coast, their hulls shattered against hidden reefs. More than 1,000 people died that night, including General Ubilla himself. The ships were scattered along approximately 50 miles of coastline from Sebastian Inlet to Fort Pierce. When dawn broke, survivors found themselves on an alien shore with fragments of the greatest treasure fleet in Spanish history washing up at their feet. The Spanish response was swift but predictable. Salvage camps were established along the coast. Divers were brought from Havana. Security was adequate for dealing with local threats. But news of the disaster traveled through the Caribbean's network of sailors, smugglers, and merchants faster than any official dispatch. In every port from Kingston to Nassau, the same conversation was happening in hushed tones over rum and hardtack. 11 ships, millions in treasure, scattered across 50 miles of coastline, guarded by whoever Spain could spare. By December 1715, Captain Henry Jennings had assembled a formidable force, 3 vessels, between 150 and 300 men, and a plan that would transform him from unemployed privateer to the founding father of Caribbean piracy. On December 28, 1715, Jennings and his fleet attacked the Spanish salvage camp. When the smoke cleared, they had made off with upwards of 350,000 pieces of 8, more wealth than most men could earn in 10 lifetimes. But here's what makes this moment revolutionary. Jennings didn't just steal treasure. He stole a blueprint. Word of the Florida raid spread like wildfire through the Caribbean underworld. Suddenly, every desperate sailor, every discharged naval officer, every ambitious cutthroat realized that the old rules no longer applied. If Henry Jennings could brazenly attack a Spanish salvage operation and sail away rich, what else was possible? Within months, Nassau had transformed from a sleepy Bahamian port into something unprecedented, a pirate republic. Men who had served different flags during the war, English, French, even Spanish, now gathered under a new banner of opportunity. Benjamin Hornigold arrived with his own crew and ambitions. Charles Vane, who had served under Jennings during the Florida raid, began assembling his own following. Edward Teach, not yet known as Blackbeard, was learning the trade under Hornigold's tutelage. Tensions ran high. When Hornigold seized some treasure that Jennings considered his due, Jennings pursued him to Nassau and robbed him in turn. The situation grew so volatile that men who sailed with both crews later testified about the raw hostility between these pirate captains. But this wasn't just about personal rivalries. Something larger was taking shape. These men were creating something that had never existed before, a functioning society built entirely outside the reach of traditional authority. They established codes of conduct, democratic decision-making processes, and systems for sharing both risks and rewards that were more egalitarian than anything found in the legitimate world. When Spanish officials or English governors demanded their arrest, Nassau's pirates simply laughed. From their island stronghold, they could strike anywhere in the Caribbean and retreat to safety among reefs that only they knew how to navigate. The 1715 treasure fleet had done more than sink. It had shattered the old certainties about who controlled the seas. But this was only the beginning. The men gathering in Nassau weren't content to remain small-time raiders picking over Spanish salvage. They had tasted the freedom that came with unlimited horizons and the brotherhood of the coast. Soon, names that would become legendary were about to emerge from this growing confederation of rogues. Edward Teach would become Blackbeard, the most feared name on the seven seas. Samuel Bellamy would captain the richest prize ever taken by pirates. Charles Vane would terrorize shipping from the Carolinas to Honduras. And in the shadows, watching and learning, a young quartermaster named Edward England was already planning campaigns that would make the Florida raid look like a child prank. The storm that sank the 1715 treasure fleet had passed in a single night, but the tempest it unleashed would rage for over a decade, changing the balance of power across the Atlantic world and creating legends that Hollywood still can't improve upon. But there's something else about this story that the history books rarely mention. Something that makes the Golden Age of Piracy far more complex and fascinating than simple tales of treasure and swordplay. These men weren't just criminals. They were revolutionaries who created the first functioning multiracial democracies in the Western Hemisphere, established systems of disability compensation and social welfare centuries before governments thought of such things, and challenged the fundamental assumptions about authority that every European empire took for granted. The Spanish treasure fleet that vanished in 1715 didn't just create pirates. It created a movement that would threaten the very foundations of colonial society. And the most dangerous pirate of them all? He wasn't even born yet when Henry Jennings raided that salvage camp. But when young Edward Teach finally claimed his place among the Brotherhood, he would become something that even veterans like Jennings and Hornigold had never imagined. A man so terrifying that his mere reputation could capture ships without firing a shot. The age of Blackbeard was about to begin. Picture this. You're standing on the deck of a merchant vessel in 1717, watching the horizon. Suddenly, a black flag appears. Your blood turns to ice, but not for the reason you'd expect. You see, that flag doesn't just mean death. It means something far more dangerous to the established order of the world. It means democracy. While kings and emperors ruled their subject with absolute authority, while merchant captains treated sailors like property, and while entire empires were built on the backs of the powerless, these outlaws created something revolutionary. They gave every man a vote. But democracy among thieves came with a price that would make even the bravest soul hesitate. Tonight, we step aboard their ships to discover what freedom truly costs in the Golden Age of Piracy. Because when you live outside the law, you create your own justice. And pirate justice? That! Dawn breaks over Nassau Harbor, 1718. The sun reveals a sight that would have been impossible just 3 years earlier. A fleet of vessels flying no nation's flag, crewed by men who answer to no king. But step closer to these ships, and you'll witness something that would shock the political philosophers of Europe. You'll see the world's first functioning maritime democracies. Every morning aboard Bartholomew Roberts' flagship, the Royal Fortune, began the same way. Every man has a vote in affairs of moment. These weren't just words painted on a tavern wall. This was Article 1 of Roberts' Pirate Code, a constitution that gave power to common sailors that they could never dream of in legitimate service. Think about what this meant. These men encoded democratic principles into their constitutions almost a century before the American Revolution. While European peasants lived and died at their lord's whim, while merchant sailors could be flogged for speaking out of turn, pirate crews were holding votes on everything from target selection to disciplinary action. When Captain Howell Davis was killed trying to kidnap the governor of Principe in 1719, his crew came together to elect a new captain. Their choice? A Welsh sailor named Bartholomew Roberts. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Roberts didn't want the job. Standing on that blood-stained deck, Roberts reportedly told his crew that since he'd been forced into piracy against his will, he might as well make the best of it. What happened next reveals both the promise and the peril of pirate democracy. Within 2 years, Roberts would become the most successful pirate captain in history, capturing over 400 ships. His democratic crew would follow him from the Caribbean to the coast of Africa, creating a reign of terror that spanned 2 continents. But what was life actually like aboard these floating republics? Descend into the belly of a pirate ship, and the romance of the sea vanishes instantly. The cornerstone of pirate cuisine was hardtack, a dense cracker made from flour, water, and salt, baked until it was nearly inedible. Imagine biting into what amounts to edible stone, often crawling with weevils, that had to be soaked in whatever liquid was available just to make it chewable. When hardtack wasn't available, pirates survived on salted beef and pork, meat so heavily preserved and dried that it often had to be softened with hammers before consumption. The smell below deck was indescribable, a mixture of rotting food, unwashed bodies, bilge water, and the ever-present stench of disease. Pirates slept in hammocks strung so close together that personal space was a luxury reserved for captains. Disease spread like wildfire in these conditions. Scurvy, dysentery, and tropical fevers could wipe out half a crew in weeks. Yet men chose this life. Thousands of them. Why would anyone voluntarily endure such conditions? The answer lay not just in the promise of wealth, but in something far more precious: dignity. Roberts' Code guaranteed that every man shall have an equal title to the fresh provisions or strong liquors at any time seized, and may use them at pleasure. Compare this to life aboard a merchant vessel, where captains lived in luxury while common sailors survived on rotten food and contaminated water. Roberts provided his crew with medical insurance, compensation for injuries sustained in the line of duty. Lose a limb in battle? The code specified exact payments. This was centuries before governments considered such protection for workers. But democracy among outlaws created unique challenges. Picture the scene: 30 armed men, all with equal votes, trying to decide whether to attack a heavily defended Spanish galleon or retreat to safety. Every decision could mean the difference between wealth and death, between freedom and the gallows. Arguments erupted constantly. Factions formed. Personal rivalries threatened to tear crews apart. And when disagreements couldn't be resolved through debate, that's when pirate justice revealed its true face. For serious crimes like mutiny, theft, or cowardice, pirates used marooning, depositing the offender on a remote island with nothing but a keg of water and a pistol. Sometimes they were given only a bottle of rum, gunpowder, and that single pistol, essentially tools for either slow death or quick suicide. But marooning was merciful compared to keel hauling. The condemned sailor would be bound with ropes and thrown into the sea, then dragged beneath the ship from bow to stern, his body torn by the sharp barnacles covering the hull. The purpose was to instill discipline and deter severe offenses through a fearsome punishment that could result in death. Death, however, wasn't always a goal. Sometimes it was a lucky outcome, because the alternative to pirate justice was often worse: capture by authorities. On May 23, 1701, Captain William Kidd was taken from Newgate Gaol in London to face execution. Kidd had once been a respected privateer, commissioned by the English government. But when political winds shifted, he was denounced as a pirate and abandoned by his former sponsors. The execution was deliberately public, designed to send a message to every sailor considering a life of piracy. Kidd was hanged at Execution Dock, his body left to swing in a gibbet as a warning to others. Yet even facing such fates, men continued choosing piracy. Because for many, the alternative, life as a powerless cog in someone else's machine, seemed worse than death. Every sailor who joined a pirate crew was expected to sign or make his mark on the articles, entitling them to vote, bear arms, receive compensation for injury, and share in the ship's plunder. These weren't just legal documents. They were declarations of independence from a world that offered no other path to dignity. But there was a contradiction at the heart of pirate democracy that would ultimately prove fatal. These men who preached equality and democratic decision-making were still, fundamentally, criminals. They sustained their freedom through violence against innocents. They built their egalitarian society on theft and murder. As pirate crews grew bolder and more successful, they drew increasing attention from naval forces. The very democratic principles that made pirate societies attractive also made them vulnerable. Every major decision required debate and voting, slowing response times when speed meant survival. Personal rivalries that might have been settled with a flogging in the Royal Navy could split pirate crews apart entirely. Democratic captains who couldn't maintain their crew's respect found themselves voted out of power, sometimes marooned on empty islands. And there was something else happening that would change everything. By 1720, the most successful pirate captains had accumulated enough wealth and reputation to become targets not just for naval forces, but for betrayal from within their own ranks. Because in a world where every man had a vote, every man also had a price. The Golden Age was built on the promise that pirates could create a better world than the one they'd left behind. But as we'll discover, some names would rise above all others, captains whose very existence challenged the foundations of colonial society. Edward Teach, still learning his trade under Benjamin Hornigold, was watching and waiting. Soon, he would take the democratic principles of pirate society and weaponize them into something the world had never seen, psychological warfare perfected. But before Blackbeard could claim his throne of terror, another captain was about to demonstrate just how high the stakes had become in the war between pirates and empires. Samuel Bellamy, a former sailor from Cape Cod, had joined the pirate republic with dreams of easy wealth. What he would achieve instead was the single richest prize in pirate history, and a demonstration of exactly why governments around the world were beginning to view piracy not as a criminal nuisance, but as an existential threat to their power. The Widder Galley was sailing north along the American coast, carrying more treasure than most men could count in a lifetime. But Bellamy's pursuit of this prize would reveal something that terrified authorities more than any amount of stolen gold. It would prove that pirate democracy wasn't just changing life at sea. It was inspiring rebellion on land. And when that news reached the halls of power in London, Madrid, and Paris, the response would be swift, brutal, and final. The age of pirate democracy was about to face its greatest test. November 28, 1717. Off the coast of Martinique, a French slave ship called La Concorde encounters two vessels flying no nation's flag. The French captain, Pierre Dosset, watches in horror as a figure emerges from the smoke, a giant of a man with a black beard flowing down to his waist. But it's not the beard that freezes the blood of every sailor watching. It's a fact that it's on fire. Slow-burning fuses, twisted through his hair and beard, wreath his head in smoke. To terrified victims, he appears to be a demon rising straight from hell. His name is Edward Teach, but history will remember him by another name entirely. Blackbeard. Tonight, we uncover how a man who began as a simple apprentice pirate transformed himself into the most feared name on the seven seas, how he weaponized terror itself, and why his reign would ultimately unite every empire in the world in a single, deadly purpose. Because Edward Teach didn't just capture ships, he captured imaginations. And in doing so, he sealed the fate of every pirate who ever lived. To understand the monster that Blackbeard became, we must first meet the man he was. Edward Teach, and yes, that was likely his real name, though even this remains shrouded in mystery, first appears in a historical record not as a captain, but as a student. In 1716, Teach arrived at New Providence Island in the Bahamas and joined the crew of Benjamin Hornigold, one of the most successful pirate captains operating out of Nassau. Hornigold had been instrumental in establishing what pirates called their republic, and he was known for his tactical brilliance and strategic mind. Hornigold commanded one of the most heavily armed ships in the region, called the Ranger, and by 1717, he had promoted Edward Teach to the position of second-in-command. But Teach was learning far more than seamanship and tactics from his mentor. He was studying the psychology of piracy. Watch Hornigold operate, and you'd see a master of calculated intimidation. Pirates succeeded not just through superior firepower, but through reputation. A ship that surrendered without a fight saved everyone time, ammunition, and lives. The key was making surrender seem like the only rational choice. Teach absorbed these lessons, but his mind was working on a larger problem. How could a pirate captain become so fearsome that ships would surrender at the mere sight of his flag? In September 1717, Hornigold promoted Teach to captain his own vessel, a subordinate position, but one that gave the ambitious Englishman his first taste of independent command. That taste would prove addictive. By late 1717, Teach was operating in the Eastern Caribbean, perfecting the techniques that would make him legendary. And then, on November 28th, opportunity presented itself in the form of a French vessel carrying human cargo. La Concorde was captured by Blackbeard and his pirates on November 28, 1717, near the island of Martinique in the West Indies. But this wasn't just another prize. This was the moment Edward Teach began his transformation into Blackbeard. La Concorde had sailed from Nantes in March 1717, loaded with 75 crew members and 16 cannons. By the time Blackbeard encountered her, the ship was carrying 455 enslaved people. 61 had already died during the horrific Middle Passage. According to Lieutenant Ono, who survived the attack, the pirate approached in 2 sloops, one carrying 120 men and 12 cannons, the other with 30 men and 8 cannons. The French captain and his crew put up little resistance because they were depleted in numbers from sickness and death. What should have been a routine capture became something far more significant. Blackbeard forced 10 French crew members to stay aboard the ship and travel with him, while 4 or 5 others voluntarily joined the pirates. But it was what he did next that revealed his true genius. After selling her cargo of slaves at Martinique, Blackbeard made the vessel his flagship, added more heavy cannons, and renamed her Queen Anne's Revenge. Think about the psychology at work here. Teach didn't just steal a ship, he transformed it into a symbol. Queen Anne's War had ended years earlier, but by invoking the memory of that conflict, he was positioning himself as something more than a common pirate. He was claiming to be the continuation of legitimate warfare by other means. But the ship was only the beginning of his transformation. The real innovation was what Edward Teach did to himself. His nickname derived from his thick black beard and fearsome appearance. He was reported to have tied lit fuses, slow matches, under his hat to frighten his enemies. Blackbeard wore his black beard and hair very long, but he never actually lit them on fire. He would put little candles or pieces of a fuse in his hair and light those. They would give off smoke, giving the pirate a fearsome, demonic appearance. Picture the scene. A merchant ship spots Queen Anne's Revenge on the horizon. As the pirate vessel approaches, smoke begins to rise from the deck. Then, through the haze, a figure emerges that seems to defy natural law. Blackbeard was also armed with 3 pairs of pistols strapped across his chest, and cutlasses and knives hanging from his clothes. He would stick slow-burning fuses into his large beard and light them, wreathing his head in smoke and creating the appearance of a demon from hell. This wasn't just intimidation. This was theater on a scale that no pirate had ever attempted. In battle, this intimidation worked. His foes often surrendered without a fight. But here's what makes Blackbeard's tactics truly revolutionary. He understood that reputation could be more valuable than actual violence. Every ship that surrendered without bloodshed spread his legend further. Every sailor who survived to tell the tale of the smoking devil who spared their lives became an unwitting agent of his psychological campaign. Within months of capturing Queen Anne's Revenge, Edward Teach had created something unprecedented. A pirate whose main name could capture ships. But was it all just theater? Or was there something genuinely terrifying beneath the smoke and spectacle? Archaeological evidence from what is believed to be the wreck of Blackbeard's flagship reveals the pirate's gruesome secrets. Metallic clusters contained lead shot, nails, and glass which were likely put in canvas bags and fired from cannons. This wasn't standard naval ammunition. This was anti-personnel ordnance designed specifically to maim and terrorize crews. Blackbeard wasn't just rejecting an image of cruelty, he was prepared to deliver it. Witness accounts from survivors paint a complex picture. Yes, Blackbeard's reputation was built on theater and intimidation, but those who resisted discovered that the performance had very real teeth. Yet there's something else in these testimonies that reveals the true genius of Blackbeard's approach. He understood that mercy could be as powerful a tool as violence. Ships that surrendered immediately were often allowed to sail away with minimal losses. Crews who cooperated were treated well. Some were even recruited into his growing fleet. But those who forced him to fight, they discovered why smoke and fire had become his calling cards. By early 1718, Blackbeard commanded a fleet of 4 vessels and nearly 400 men. Queen Anne's Revenge had been equipped with 40 cannons, making it one of the most powerful pirate ships ever assembled. But power brought new challenges. A fleet this large required constant feeding, food, ammunition, medicine, and above all, fresh prizes to keep the crew satisfied. It was then that Blackbeard conceived his most audacious plan yet. Instead of simply raiding individual ships, he would blockade an entire port. He would hold a major colonial city for ransom. His target? Charlestown, South Carolina, one of the busiest and wealthiest ports in North America. He formed an alliance of pirates and blockaded the port of Charlestown, South Carolina, ransoming the port's inhabitants. For over a week in May 1718, no ship could enter or leave Charlestown harbor without Blackbeard's permission. The most powerful pirate in the Caribbean had effectively declared war on colonial society itself. But this triumph would also mark the beginning of his downfall, because by blockading Charlestown, Blackbeard had crossed a line that governments could not ignore. News of the blockade raced through the colonial network faster than any ship could sail. In London, Madrid, and Paris, officials who had previously viewed piracy as a regional nuisance suddenly understood that they were facing something far more dangerous. Blackbeard wasn't just stealing cargo. He was challenging the fundamental authority of colonial government. But Edward Teach had made one critical miscalculation. In transforming himself into a legend, he had also made himself the perfect target. Every government that had tolerated or ignored piracy now had a face to focus their anger on. Every naval officer who had failed to capture pirates now had a name that could redeem their reputation. Blackbeard had become too successful for his own good. Yet even the colonial authorities began planning their response. Something else was happening in the Caribbean that would change everything. Because Blackbeard was not the only terror on the seas. While Edward Teach was perfecting psychological warfare in the Atlantic, another captain was writing his own chapter in pirate legend. A former Royal Navy officer turned pirate, whose approach to profession would prove that there was more than one way to terrify the civilized world. His name was Bartholomew Roberts, and his story would demonstrate that intellect could be just as deadly as intimidation. Roberts would capture over 400 ships, more than Blackbeard, Henry Morgan, and Captain Kidd combined. His success would be built not on theatrical smoke and fire, but on mathematical precision and strategic brilliance. And unlike Blackbeard, who relied on reputation and fear, Roberts would perfect something far more dangerous. He would make piracy efficient. But there was another figure rising in the Caribbean whose story would prove that the Golden Age of Piracy was far from over. A gentleman plantation owner from Barbados who would abandon his comfortable life to join the Brotherhood of the Coast. His name was Stede Bonnet, and his reasons for turning pirate would reveal something that authorities found even more terrifying than Blackbeard's smoke and mirrors. Bonnet proved that piracy wasn't just attracting desperate sailors and discharged privateers anymore. It was beginning to appeal to the wealthy and educated, people who had everything to lose and chose piracy anyway. When colonial governors realized that even plantation owners were abandoning civilization for life under the Black Flag, they understood that the pirate republic had become more than a criminal organization. It had become a revolution. October 20th, 1720, off the coast of Jamaica, a British naval sloop closes in on a pirate vessel. The crew of the cornered ship is drunk, hiding below deck, too cowardly to fight. But 2 figures remain on deck, cutlasses in hand, screaming at their cowardly shipmates, "Come up, you cowards, and fight like men." Those 2 figures, they weren't men at all. Their names were Bonnie and Mary Red, 2 women who had disguised themselves as male pirates, fought alongside the most feared cutthroats of the Caribbean, and were about to make legal history in a way that would shock the colonial world. Tonight, we uncover the extraordinary lives of the only 2 female pirates of the Golden Age, how they shattered every convention of their time, why they chose lives of violence over lives of safety, and how their final stand would reveal something that terrified authorities far more than Blackbeard's burning beard. Because Bonnie and Mary Read didn't just break the law, they broke every rule about what women could be. And in doing so, they proved that the pirate revolution was spreading far beyond the Brotherhood of the Coast. To understand how two women came to terrorize the Caribbean alongside history's most notorious pirates, we must first understand the world they escaped from. And Bonny was born around 1698 near Cork, Ireland, probably the illegitimate daughter of William Cormac, a lawyer, and his maidservant. Her father raised her as a boy, perhaps to avoid scandal, perhaps recognizing something fierce in her nature that conventional female upbringing couldn't contain. When and was still young, Cormac moved his family to South Carolina, where he became a successful merchant and plantation owner. But his temperament proved challenging for polite colonial society. Apocryphal stories claim that in her youth, she had beaten an attempted rapist so badly that he was hospitalized. Whether true or not, such tales reveal how Bonny was perceived even before she turned pirate, as a woman who refused to be a victim. In 1718, against her father's wishes, and married a penniless sailor named James Bonny. Her father disowned her immediately, and the newlyweds sailed for the Bahamas, hoping to find work in Nassau. Nassau in 1718 was still the unofficial capital of the pirate republic. Ships flying black flags filled the harbor. Former privateers, discharged naval officers, and runaway servants had created a society where traditional rules didn't apply. And it was there that Bonny met the man who would change her life forever. John Rackham, known throughout the Caribbean as Calico Jack because of his habit of wearing colorful calico clothing, was everything James Bonny was not. Where her husband was timid and poor, Rackham was bold and successful. Where James sought respectability, Calico Jack embodied freedom. The affair between and Calico Jack became the talk of Nassau. But this wasn't just about romance. This was about a woman choosing her own path in a world that offered women almost no choices at all. When left her husband to sail with Calico Jack's crew, she didn't just abandon her marriage. She abandoned civilization itself. But Bonny wasn't the only woman who would make this choice. Mary Read's path to piracy began even earlier. Born in London around 1695, Mary was dressed and raised as a boy from infancy. Her mother schemed to claim financial support from the family of Mary's deceased older brother. This deception became Mary's way of life. As a teenager, she enlisted in the British military, still disguised as a man. She served with distinction in European campaigns, proving herself in battles where many male soldiers failed. But Mary Read wanted more than military service could offer. She had tasted independence, proven herself capable of anything men could do. When peace was declared and military opportunities dwindled, she made a choice that would seem impossible to most women of her era. She boarded a ship bound for the West Indies, still disguised as a man, seeking whatever adventures the Caribbean might offer. The exact circumstances of how Mary Read joined Calico Jack's crew remain unclear, but by 1719, she was aboard his ship, still maintaining her male disguise. Most of the crew believed they were serving alongside another sailor named Mark Read. Only Bonny, with a woman's intuition and perhaps recognizing something familiar in Mary's manner, discovered the truth. What happened next has fascinated historians for centuries. Did Mary become lovers? Close friends? Rivals? The historical record is frustratingly vague, but one thing is certain. Together, they formed a partnership that would make them the most feared fighters in Calico Jack's crew. Because whatever else they were to each other, Bonny and Mary Read were warriors. Contemporary accounts describe them as more vicious in battle than any of their male counterparts. They fought with cutlasses and pistols, showing no mercy to enemies and no fear of death. Witnesses claim they were often the first aboard captured vessels and the last to retreat from danger. But their presence on the crew created complications beyond simple combat effectiveness. Traditional maritime superstition held that women aboard ships brought bad luck. Most pirates shared these beliefs, and the discovery of female crew members could cause panic, mutiny, or desertion. Bonny solved this problem by not hiding her gender from the crew. She made it clear that she was a woman, Calico Jack's lover, and as dangerous as any man aboard. Anyone who objected could settle the matter with steel. Mary Read took a different approach, maintaining her male disguise except from Jack. This created a delicate balance of secrets that required constant vigilance. For over a year, this arrangement worked perfectly. Calico Jack's crew, strengthened by two of the most capable fighters in the Caribbean, terrorized shipping from Jamaica to Cuba. But success bred overconfidence. And overconfidence, in the pirate world, was often fatal. On October 19, 1720, Calico Jack's crew was anchored off Negro Point, Jamaica, celebrating a recent capture. Rum flowed freely. Guard duties were neglected. Everyone aboard assumed they were safe in familiar waters. They were wrong. Captain Jonathan Barnett, commanding a British naval sloop, had been tracking Calico Jack for weeks. Now, under cover of darkness, he closed in on the celebrating pirates. When the attack came at dawn, most of Calico Jack's crew was too drunk to fight effectively. Men who had terrorized merchant captains cowered below deck, too cowardly or too intoxicated to defend their ship. Only 2 crew members remained on deck to fight the Royal Navy boarding party. And Bonnie and Mary Read stood side by side, cutlasses flashing, pistols firing, screaming at their shipmates, "Come up, you cowards, and fight like men." But courage wasn't enough against overwhelming odds. Within hours, the entire crew was captured and bound for Spanish Town, Jamaica, to face trial for piracy. The trial that followed would make legal history. On November 16, 1720, Calico Jack Rackham and his male crew members faced court. Their fate was never in doubt. Piracy was a capital offense, and the evidence was overwhelming. All were sentenced to death by hanging. But Bonnie and Mary Red presented the court with an unprecedented situation. Never before had colonial authorities been forced to try women for piracy. The women's trial took place on November 28, 1720. The evidence against them was just as overwhelming as it had been against their male counterparts. Witnesses testified to their ferocity in battle, their participation in captures, their volleys of profanity that would make hardened sailors blush. The verdict was inevitable: guilty of piracy, sentenced to hang. But then came the moment that would save their lives and change legal precedent forever. When asked if they had anything to say before sentencing, both women replied in unison, "My lord, we plead our bellies." Both Bonnie and Mary Read were pregnant. Under English law, pregnant women could not be executed until after giving birth. The death sentences were postponed indefinitely. This legal maneuver revealed something profound about these 2 women. Even facing death, they had found a way to use a very biological reality that their society saw as weakness, pregnancy, as a source of power. Mary Read would never live to see freedom. She died in prison in April 1721, likely from fever, still awaiting the birth of her child. And Bonnie's fate remains one of history's great mysteries. She disappeared from the historical record after November 1720. Some claimed her wealthy father paid for her release. Others suggested she escaped. A few believed she returned to respectability under a different name. But the impact of these 2 women extended far beyond their individual fates. And Bonnie and Mary Red had proven that the pirate revolution could attract anyone, even those whom society considered most powerless. If respectable plantation owners like Steve Bonnet could abandon civilization for piracy, if women could successfully masquerade as male pirates for years, then what other assumptions about colonial society might be wrong? Colonial authorities began to realize they weren't just dealing with criminal activity anymore. They were confronting a genuine alternative society, one that offered dignity, equality, and opportunity to people who could never find these things within legitimate institutions. The pirate queens had proved that the Brotherhood of the Coast was more than just criminals seeking easy wealth. It was becoming a revolution that threatened the very foundations of the colonial world. And that realization would change everything. By 1721, every major naval power was beginning to coordinate efforts to crush piracy once and for all. The age of tolerance and occasional cooperation with pirates was ending. What would follow would be a systematic campaign of extermination. But the pirate republic would not go quietly into history. As naval forces gathered and colonial governors issued new bounties, the most successful pirates were planning their most audacious campaigns yet. Bartholomew Roberts, the mathematical genius of piracy, was about to demonstrate that intelligence and organization could defeat even the mightiest naval forces. And in the shadows, other captains are preparing for what they knew would be piracy's final stand. They understood that the age of easy prizes was ending. What came next would separate the legend from the forgotten. But perhaps the greatest legacy of Bonnie and Mary Red wasn't their individual courage or their legal maneuvering. Perhaps it was a question they left behind, the challenge they posed to everyone who heard their story. If two women could live as pirates for years without detection, fighting alongside the most dangerous men in the Caribbean and earning their respect through skill and courage alone, what other impossible things might be possible? That question would haunt colonial society long after the last pirate flag was struck, because Bonnie and Mary Red had proved that the rules everyone took for granted weren't laws of nature. They were just choices, and choices could be changed. 1696. A ship called the Fancy sails into Nassau Harbor carrying the greatest pirate treasure in history. Her captain, using the alias Henry Bridgman, requests an audience with Governor Nicholas Trott. What happened in that private meeting would transform a sleepy colonial outpost into the most dangerous place in the Western Hemisphere. The captain wasn't Henry Bridgman at all. He was Henry Avery, the most wanted pirate in the British Empire. And the treasure he laid before the governor? Stolen from the great mogul himself. Governor Trott looked at the fortune before him, then at the ship still loaded with 50 tons of elephant tusks and 100 barrels of gunpowder, then at a man who could make him richer than any colonial governor in history. And with that handshake, the Pirate Republic was born. Tonight, we enter the world's first criminal state, a place where democracy flourished among thieves, where escaped slaves found freedom, and where the rules of civilization simply didn't apply. But this paradise of outlaws contained the seeds of its own destruction. Because when you build a nation on betrayal, eventually someone will betray you. To understand how Nassau became the capital of the pirate world, we must first understand what it was before. Nothing. New Providence Island in the 1690s was a backwater. The original colonial settlement had been destroyed by Spanish raiders. Most legitimate colonists had fled. The harbor, while naturally deep and defensible, was surrounded by empty buildings and abandoned fortifications. It was perfect for men who needed to disappear. When Henry Avery arrived with his stolen treasure, he found exactly what every pirate dreams of, a place with natural defenses, corrupt officials, and no questions asked. Avery bribed Governor Nicholas Trott with gold and silver, and with the Fancy itself, still loaded with 50 tons of elephant tusks and 100 barrels of gunpowder. But Avery's bribe was more than simple corruption. It was a business proposal. Think about it from Trott's perspective. The Bahamas generated almost no legitimate revenue. Spanish raiders attacked regularly. London provided minimal support. But here was Henry Avery offering a different model entirely. What if, instead of trying to prevent piracy, Nassau became the center of it? What if pirates could operate safely from Bahamian waters in exchange for sharing their profits with colonial officials? This established Nassau as a base where pirates could operate safely, although various governors regularly made a show of suppressing piracy when London's attention turned their way. Music becomes more adventurous. The results exceeded even Avery's expectations. Within a decade, Nassau had transformed from an empty harbor into a thriving criminal metropolis. By 1715, when the Spanish treasure fleet wrecked off Florida and Henry Jennings launched a raid that started the Golden Age, Nassau was ready. The infrastructure was in place. The corrupt relationships were established. All that was needed was the right catalyst. Picture Nassau Harbor in 1717, 24 pirate vessels at anchor, their black flags snapping in the Caribbean breeze. Ships from England anchored alongside vessels from France, Spain, and the American colonies. Former Royal Navy officers shared rum with escaped slaves, discharged soldiers, and runaway indentured servants. Rich with plundered wealth, Nassau attracted more pirates who were joined by smugglers, prostitutes, and others. The city was loosely administered by a governor who used the pirate code of conduct as a basis for its laws. Step into any Nassau tavern during this period, and you'd witness something unprecedented in the colonial world. True diversity. At a single table, you might find Benjamin Hornigold discussing navigation with former Spanish naval officers, while Charles Vane argued politics with escaped plantation slaves who had found freedom among the pirates. Women disguised as men drank alongside legitimate merchants who had come to Nassau to buy stolen goods at favorable prices. The common language was English, Spanish, or French, depending on who was doing the talking. But the universal currency was pieces of 8, and everyone's money was equally welcome. This wasn't just criminal activity. This was the world's first truly multiracial democracy. Pirates elected their captains. Crews voted on targets and tactics. Disputes were settled by democratic process rather than aristocratic privilege. Former slaves could rise to positions of command based solely on their abilities. Compare this to the legitimate colonial world, where your birth determined your fate, where skin color dictated your opportunities, where speaking out against authority could result in flogging or imprisonment. But Nassau's success created unexpected complications. By 1717, the pirate republic was generating more revenue than most legitimate colonies. Ships loaded with stolen treasure were arriving weekly. The harbor was so crowded that new arrivals had to anchor in the outer roads. This success attracted attention from London, but not the kind of attention pirates wanted. British officials began receiving reports that a criminal state was operating under their own flag. Worse, this criminal state was becoming so successful that it was disrupting legitimate trade throughout the Caribbean. Something had to be done, but the solution wouldn't come from military force alone. The British had tried that approach before, and pirates simply melted away into the vast network of Caribbean islands, only to reappear elsewhere. This time, London would try something different. They would fight corruption with corruption. On January 6, 1718, British Captain Woodes Rogers was named Captain General and Governor-in-Chief of Nassau. But Rogers wasn't just any colonial appointee. He was a former privateer himself, a man who understood the pirate mentality because he had lived it. More importantly, he came armed with something no previous governor had possessed: royal pardons. Rogers offered every pirate in Nassau a choice: accept the king's pardon, abandon piracy forever, or face the combined might of the Royal Navy. The response split the pirate community down the middle. Hornigold accepted the pardon and surrendered himself to Woodes Rogers. Rogers then commissioned him to hunt down other pirates, including his former second-in-command, Teach Blackbeard. Think about what this meant. Benjamin Hornigold, one of the founding fathers of the Pirate Republic, had switched sides. The man who had trained Edward Teach, who had helped establish Nassau as a pirate stronghold, was now hunting his former allies. But Hornigold wasn't alone in his betrayal. Hornigold enthusiastically embraced the offer and used his knowledge of the region and pirate tactics to hunt his former comrades, capturing 10 by December 1718. The man who had once symbolized pirate independence was now using everything he knew about pirate tactics to destroy the very community he had helped create. On the morning of the 12th of December, 1718, 9 of them were executed in Nassau. This act re-established British control and ended the Pirates' Republic in the Bahamas. Picture that morning. 9 men who had lived by the pirate code, who had voted in pirate assemblies, who had shared in democratic plunder, now hanging from gallows in the harbor they had once called home. But the executions revealed something even more chilling about the end of the Pirate Republic. The men who died weren't captured in battle by the Royal Navy. They were betrayed by their own former captain, a man who knew their hiding places, their tactics, their weaknesses. Hornigold had proved that pirate democracy contained a fatal flaw. When everyone has a vote, anyone can be bought. Yet even as Nassau fell to legitimate authority, the pirate dream refused to die. In a final act of defiance, pirates including Charles Vane and others launched a daring assault at the blockade involving a fire ship. Charles Vane, who had learned his trade under Henry Jennings during the Florida Treasure Fleet raid, refused to accept Rogers' pardon. Instead, he loaded an old sloop with combustible materials, set it ablaze, and sailed it directly into Rogers' fleet under cover of darkness. The fire ship attack failed, but Vane escaped in the confusion. Along with him sailed the last remnants of the Pirate Republic, men like Edward Teach, who had already transformed himself into Blackbeard, and others who refused to surrender their freedom for promises of royal mercy. These holdouts scattered across the Caribbean, carrying with them the democratic ideals and revolutionary spirit that Nassau had nurtured. But they also carried something else, the knowledge that their own leaders could not be trusted. The betrayal of Benjamin Hornigold had shattered more than just pirate morale. It had revealed that the brotherhood they had believed in was more fragile than they had imagined. If Hornigold could switch sides, who else might be tempted by royal pardons? If the founder of Nassau could hunt his former allies, what did loyalty mean among pirates? These questions would haunt the remaining pirates as they attempted to rebuild their communities elsewhere. But they would also drive them to even more desperate measures. Because men who had lost their homeland, who had been betrayed by their leaders, who had watched their republic die, had nothing left to lose. And that made them more dangerous than ever. Blackbeard would prove this within months, when his blockade of Charlestown demonstrated that the fall of Nassau had not ended pirate power. It had simply made it more desperate and more violent. Bartholomew Roberts would show that pirate democracy could survive even without a permanent base, creating a floating republic that would prove impossible for any navy to destroy. But perhaps the most significant legacy of the Nassau Republic wasn't its success or its eventual fall. Perhaps it was a proof it provided that alternative societies were possible. For over 2 decades, Nassau had demonstrated that men could govern themselves without kings or aristocrats, that former enemies could cooperate as equals, that democracy could function even among criminals. Colonial authorities throughout the Americas had watched Nassau's experiment with growing alarm, not because it was criminal, but because it was attractive. If pirates could create a successful democratic society, if escaped slaves could find freedom and dignity among outlaws, if common sailors could rise to positions of leadership based on merit rather than birth, what did that say about the legitimate world they were trying to preserve? The answer to that question would drive the final phase of the war against piracy, because the real threat posed by pirates wasn't their theft or their violence. It was their example. And examples, once planted, have a way of growing in unexpected places. The Republic of Nassau was dead, but the republic of ideas it had spawned was spreading across the Atlantic world, inspiring revolution in ways that no governor or admiral could control. The empires were watching, and their patience was running out. July 22nd, 1718. 7 British warships appear on the horizon at Nassau Harbor. For the first time in over 2 decades, the Royal Navy has come to the pirate capital not to negotiate, not to trade, but to end it. Standing on the lead vessel's quarterdeck is Captain Wood Rogers, former privateer turned imperial enforcer. In his cabin sits a document that will transform the Caribbean forever. A royal proclamation offering every pirate a choice between redemption and destruction. His Majesty's most gracious pardon for the suppression of piracy. The age of tolerance was over. For 20 years, empires had looked the other way while pirates built their republic. They had even profited from it, buying stolen goods and hiring pirates as privateers when wars demanded. But Nassau had proven something that terrified every crown in Europe, that men could govern themselves, that democracy could flourish without kings. That threat could no longer be tolerated. Tonight, we witness the empire's systematic campaign to destroy not just piracy, but the revolutionary ideas it represented. A war that would transform former pirates into hunters of their own kind, and prove that in the world of empires, there was no such thing as permanent loyalty. To understand why the British Empire finally decided to destroy the Pirate Republic, we must first understand what had changed in London's corridors of power. By 1717, reports reaching London painted a disturbing picture. Nassau wasn't just a criminal hideout anymore. It was a functioning alternative to colonial society. Pirates had created democratic institutions, established equitable distribution of wealth, and provided opportunities for advancement that legitimate colonies couldn't match. Worse yet, this alternative was proving attractive to people who should have been loyal subjects. The solution required a different kind of leader, someone who understood pirates because he had been one himself. Wood Rogers had circumnavigated the globe as a privateer between 1708 and 1711, capturing Spanish treasure ships and rescuing Alexander Selkirk, the real-life Robinson Crusoe, from Juan Fernandez Island. He knew how pirates thought, how they operated, what motivated them. More importantly, he understood that military force alone couldn't solve the piracy problem. You had to offer pirates something they wanted more than freedom. On July 22, 1718, Rogers arrived in Nassau Harbor with an unprecedented force, 7 warships carrying over 100 cannons and nearly 500 Royal Marines. But his most powerful weapon wasn't military, it was psychological. Rogers brought with him the king's pardon, offering complete amnesty to any pirate who surrendered before September 5, 1718. Accept the pardon, abandon piracy forever, and all past crimes will be forgiven. Refuse, and face the full might of the Royal Navy. The response split Nassau's pirate community in ways that revealed the fundamental tensions within their supposed brotherhood. Benjamin Hornigold, one of the founders of the Pirate Republic, accepted the pardon almost immediately. So did over 300 other pirates, nearly half of Nassau's criminal population. But others, led by Charles Vane, saw Rogers' arrival as a declaration of war. In a final act of defiance, Charles Vane launched a fireship attack against Rogers' fleet. Under cover of darkness, Vane loaded an old sloop with combustible materials, set it ablaze, and sailed it directly toward the British warships. The attack failed, but Vane escaped in confusion, taking with him the last remnants of Nassau's hardcore pirates, men who refused to trade their freedom for promises of royal mercy. But Rogers' real masterstroke came next. In July 1718, Rogers commissioned Benjamin Hornigold, the man who had trained Blackbeard, who had helped establish Nassau as a pirate stronghold, to hunt down his former allies. Think about the psychology at work here. Rogers had taken the most respected pirate captain in Nassau and transformed him into an agent of imperial authority. Every pirate who saw Hornigold's ship on the horizon would know that their own former leader was hunting them. Hornigold embraced his new role with devastating effectiveness. Using his intimate knowledge of pirate tactics, hideouts, and personalities, he captured 10 pirates by December 1718. On December 9th, Rogers brought these 10 men to trial. 9 were convicted of piracy and sentenced to death. On December 12, 1718, 8 of these men were hanged in Nassau Harbor, the first public executions in what had been the pirate capital of the world. One of the condemned, Thomas Morris, reportedly quipped as he climbed the gallows, "We have a good governor, but a harsh one." But the hangings represented more than just punishment for criminal activity. They marked the symbolic death of the pirate republic itself. Picture that scene. 8 men who had lived by democratic pirate codes, who had voted in pirate assemblies, who had shared equally in democratic plunder, now swinging from gallows erected in the harbor they had once called home. The message was unmistakable. The age of pirate democracy was over. Yet Rogers' campaign revealed something that would haunt imperial authority for years to come. The ideas that pirates had spread couldn't be killed with rope and gunpowder, because the pirates who escaped Nassau didn't simply return to random criminal activity. They carried with them a burning hatred of the imperial system that had destroyed their homeland, and a determination to prove that pirate principles could survive anywhere. Charles Vane, who had led the fireship attack against Rogers, became more radical than ever. After initially accepting a king's pardon in 1718, Vane returned to piracy within months, taking with him Edward England and John Calico Jack Rackham. This pattern of accepting pardons and then returning to piracy terrified authorities. It suggested that the problem wasn't just criminal behavior, it was ideological commitment to an alternative way of life. But Rogers had created another type of enemy, professional pirate hunters. Jonathan Barnett represents the new breed of imperial enforcer that Rogers' campaign produced. A former privateer commissioned by Nicholas Laws, governor of Jamaica, Barnett hunted pirates with the systematic efficiency of a modern police force. On October 20th, 1720, Barnett tracked Calico Jack Rackham to Negro Point, Jamaica. What happened next revealed both the effectiveness of the new imperial campaign and the depths to which the pirate community had fallen. Rackham's crew, once proud members of the Nassau Republic, were too drunk to fight when Barnett attacked. Most had below deck like cowards, abandoning their captain and the 2 female crew members who fought beside him. Only Bonnie and Mary Red remained on deck to face Barnett's boarding party, screaming at their shipmates, "Come up, you cowards, and fight like men." The capture of Calico Jack's crew marked a turning point in the war against piracy. These weren't the disciplined, democratic pirates of Nassau's Golden Age. These were desperate criminals whose community had been shattered by betrayal and imperial pressure. The trial that followed demonstrated how thoroughly the imperial system had learned to deal with pirate ideology. Rackham and his male crew were quickly tried, convicted, and executed. But Bonnie and Mary Red presented a unique opportunity for imperial justice to make a statement about the fate of anyone who challenged established order. Both women were sentenced to death, but then played their final card. "My lord, we plead our bellies." Both were pregnant, and English law forbade executing pregnant women. The Empire's response was coldly systematic. Mary Read died in prison of fever in April 1721, still awaiting execution, and Bonnie simply vanished from the historical record. Some claimed her wealthy father bought her freedom, others suggested she escaped. But the truth remains unknown. But the real significance of these trials wasn't the fate of individual pirates. It was what they revealed about the systematic nature of the imperial campaign. Every captured pirate became a source of intelligence about others still at large. Every execution was designed to terrorize potential recruits. Every offer of pardon came with conditions that transformed former pirates into agents of the system they had once opposed. By 1721, the war against piracy had become a coordinated international effort. British, French, Spanish, and Dutch naval forces were sharing intelligence and coordinating operations in ways that had never happened before. The pirate threat had forced traditional enemies to cooperate, creating what amounted to the first international police force in maritime history. But there was something else happening that imperial authorities found even more disturbing than active piracy: the spread of pirate ideas into legitimate society. Reports reached London of merchant crews demanding democratic representation in ship decisions. Colonial newspapers published accounts of pirate democracy that seemed almost admiring. Escaped slaves throughout the Caribbean were forming communities based on principles they had learned from pirate societies. The empire was discovering that you could hang every pirate in the world, but you couldn't hang an idea whose time had come. This realization would drive the final, most brutal phase of the war against piracy, because imperial authorities understood that they weren't just fighting criminals anymore. They were fighting the future. Yet even as the noose tightened around the remaining pirate strongholds, one captain remained at large whose success would prove that the Golden Age was far from over. Bartholomew Roberts, the mathematical genius of piracy, was about to demonstrate that intelligence and organization could defeat even the most systematic imperial campaign. His methods would be so effective, his success so complete, that he would force every naval power in the Atlantic to reevaluate everything they thought they knew about fighting piracy. But Roberts would also prove something that terrified the empires even more than his tactical brilliance: that pirate democracy could evolve, adapt, and survive even under the most intensive persecution. The war against pirates had succeeded in destroying their republic, but it had also created something far more dangerous: pirate revolutionaries with nothing left to lose. And soon, the seas would witness the bloodiest battles yet. November 22nd, 1718. Dawn breaks over Ocracoke Inlet, North Carolina. Two small sloops approach through the morning mist, flying no colors, making no signals. Aboard the Adventure, Edward Teach, Blackbeard, watches through his spyglass as the vessels draw closer. His crew of 19 men prepare for what they assume will be another routine capture. They have no idea they're about to fight for their lives. Robert Maynard, commanding those approaching sloops, hasn't come to negotiate. He hasn't come to trade. He's come with orders from the governor of Virginia that are breathtakingly simple. Bring back Blackbeard's head. What happens in the next 2 hours will end the career of history's most famous pirate. But it will also reveal something that authorities never expected to discover about the man behind the legend. When the smoke clears and the blood settles, investigators will find evidence that Blackbeard wasn't just a terrorizing monster. He was a man caught between two worlds, trying to find legitimacy while clinging to the only life he'd ever known. Tonight, we witness the final stands that ended the Golden Age of Piracy. Deaths that weren't just individual tragedies, but the symbolic destruction of everything the pirate republic had represented. Because when Blackbeard fell at Ocracoke Inlet, more than just one man died. An entire way of life died with him. To understand why Blackbeard had to die, we must first understand how desperately he had been trying to live legitimately. In June 1718, just 5 months before his death, Edward Teach had accepted the king's pardon from Governor Charles Eden of North Carolina. Officially, Blackbeard had abandoned piracy forever. He settled in Bath, North Carolina, married a local woman named Mary Ormond, possibly his 14th wife, and attempted to establish himself as a respectable citizen. But respectability proved harder to achieve than anyone imagined. Colonial society wasn't ready to accept a reformed Blackbeard. Merchants refused to trade with him. Former victims demanded justice. Rival politicians used his presence to attack Governor Eden's administration. Meanwhile, Blackbeard's attempts at legitimate business failed spectacularly. The man who had once commanded fleets and terrorized empires found himself struggling to make a living as a small-time trader. By October 1718, rumors began circulating that Blackbeard had returned to piracy. Whether these rumors were true remains unclear, but they reached the ears of Alexander Spotswood, governor of Virginia. Spotswood saw an opportunity. Capturing Blackbeard would make his reputation, boost his political standing, and demonstrate Virginia's commitment to suppressing piracy. On November 17, 1718, Spotswood commissioned Lieutenant Robert Maynard of HMS Pearl to hunt down Blackbeard, offering substantial reward for the pirate's capture, dead or alive. Maynard departed Hampton Roads with 2 sloops, the Ranger and the Jane. 35 men total, armed with cutlasses, pistols, and an absolute determination to end Blackbeard's career permanently. What Maynard didn't know was that Blackbeard had received advance warning of the expedition. Corrupt officials in Virginia, possibly even within Spotswood's own administration, had tipped off the pirate. Blackbeard could have escaped, should have escaped. Instead, he chose to fight. The question that haunts historians is, why? On the evening of November 21st, Maynard anchored his sloops near Ocracoke Inlet and prepared for battle. His plan was audacious in its simplicity: approach Blackbeard's position at dawn and overwhelm him with superior numbers. But Blackbeard had his own plan. After anchoring off the southern tip of Ocracoke Island the night before, Maynard ordered his 2 ships to advance on Blackbeard on the morning of November 22nd, 1718. The Virginian expedition quickly lost the element of surprise, however, when both the Ranger and the Jane ran aground. Picture the scene. 2 British naval vessels stuck fast in the shallow waters of Pamlico Sound, their crews working frantically to free them while Blackbeard watches from the Adventure. This was exactly the kind of tactical advantage that had made Blackbeard legendary. He knew these waters intimately. Every reef, every current, every hidden sandbar that could trap an enemy vessel. But Maynard wasn't just any naval officer. As the British sloops worked themselves free and resumed their approach, Blackbeard made a decision that revealed something fundamental about his character. Instead of using his advantage to escape, he chose to meet them head-on. The battle began with an exchange of cannon fire that demonstrated the ferocity both sides brought to this encounter. But this wasn't just a naval engagement. This was a personal duel between 2 very different concepts of authority. Maynard represented imperial law, royal authority, the established order that demanded absolute obedience. Blackbeard represented democracy, individual freedom, the revolutionary idea that men could govern themselves. On November 22nd, Blackbeard's forces were defeated and he was killed in a bloody battle of Ocracoke Island. Legend has it that Blackbeard, who captured more than 30 ships in his brief pirating career, received 5 musket ball wounds and 20 sword lacerations before dying. But the raw numbers don't capture the human drama of what happened next. When Maynard's men boarded the Adventure, they found Blackbeard in the midst of what can only be described as a berserker fury. Blackbeard fought ferociously but was shot 5 times and slashed more than 20 times before finally dying. His head was severed and hung from Maynard's bowsprit as a trophy. But witnesses reported something that chilled even hardened naval veterans. Blackbeard continued fighting long after wounds that should have killed him. He seemed to be sustained by pure willpower, refusing to surrender even when defeat was certain. Led by Royal Navy Lieutenant Robert Maynard, the Navy approached Blackbeard just off the coast of Ocracoke on November 22nd, 1718, and in the ensuing battle, Blackbeard suffered a reported 25 stab wounds and 5 bullets. Blackbeard was subsequently beheaded, with his head hung on the bow of Maynard's vessel. When Maynard's sloops returned to Hampton Roads carrying Blackbeard's head, crowds gathered to witness the end of an era. But what they saw wasn't just a pirate's death. It was a symbolic execution of the idea that common men could challenge imperial authority and win. But Blackbeard's death wasn't the only famous last stand of this period. 700 miles away, another drama was unfolding that would prove equally significant. On October 20th, 1720, Captain Jonathan Barnett cornered Calico Jack Rackham off the coast of Jamaica. What happened during that capture revealed how far the pirate community had fallen from the disciplined democracy of Nassau's Golden Age. Rackham's crew was too drunk to fight effectively. When Barnett's men boarded their vessel, most of the pirates hid below deck like cowards, abandoning their captain to face capture alone. Only 2 crew members remained on deck to fight, and Bonnie and Mary Red, the female pirates who had disguised themselves as men to join the Brotherhood of the Coast. As Barnett's men overwhelmed the ship, and Bonnie screamed at her cowering shipmates, "Come up, you cowards, and fight like men." But courage wasn't enough against overwhelming odds. Within hours, Rackham and his entire crew were in chains, bound for Spanish Town, Jamaica, to face trial for piracy. The trial of Calico Jack's crew provided the perfect opportunity for colonial authorities to demonstrate what happened to those who challenged imperial order. Rackham and his male crew members were quickly convicted and sentenced to death. Their fate was never in doubt. Piracy was a capital offense, and the evidence was overwhelming. But it was what happened in the condemned cell that created one of history's most famous last words. According to Captain Charles Johnson's account, When Bonnie visited Calico Jack before his execution, her words were sharp and unforgiving. But it was Mary Read's comment to Rackham that would echo through history. Looking at the man who had led them into capture through his weakness and incompetence, Mary Read reportedly declared, "If you had fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog." Think about what those words represented. This was a woman who had lived her entire adult life disguised as a man, who had proven herself in battle against hardened pirates, telling a male captain that he had failed to live up to the very ideals of courage and honor that the pirate code demanded. Calico Jack Rackham was hanged on November 18th, 1720, his body left swinging in a gibbet at Gallows Point as a warning to other potential pirates. But Bonnie and Mary Read presented colonial justice with an unprecedented problem. How do you execute pregnant women? Both women declared to the court, "My lord, we plead our bellies." Under English law, pregnant women could not be executed until after giving birth. Mary Read would never see freedom again. She died in Spanish Town Jail in April 1721, probably from fever, still awaiting the birth of her child. And Bonnie's fate remains one of history's great mysteries. She simply vanished from the historical record after her trial. Some claimed her wealthy father bought her freedom. Others suggested she escaped or died in prison. The truth died with her. But the significance of these final stands extended far beyond the individual fates of famous pirates. Each of these deaths marked the end of something larger. Blackbeard's fall at Ocracoke demonstrated that even the most fearsome individual pirate could be destroyed by systematic imperial action. The capture of Calico Jack's crew proved that the pirate community had lost the discipline and courage that had once made them formidable. By 1721, the coordinated campaign against piracy was showing devastating results. Nassau had fallen to Woodes Rogers. Blackbeard was dead. The female pirates were gone. Even successful captains like Benjamin Hornigold had switched sides to hunt their former allies. Yet one captain remained at large whose success would prove that reports of piracy's death were greatly exaggerated. Bartholomew Roberts, the mathematical genius of piracy, was still operating with devastating effectiveness. His systematic approach to maritime warfare had allowed him to capture over 400 ships, more than Blackbeard, Henry Morgan, and Captain Kidd combined. But Roberts would also prove something that imperial authorities found deeply disturbing, that pirate democracy could evolve, adapt, and survive even the most intensive persecution. The famous last stands had ended individual careers, but they had also created martyrs whose examples would inspire a final, desperate phase of pirate resistance. Because when you systematically destroy a community's leaders, you don't eliminate the community's ideas. You radicalize the survivors. And the survivors of the Golden Age's bloodiest period were about to prove that they had learned something from watching their heroes fall. They had learned that compromise with imperial authority was impossible, that accepting pardons was a trap, that the only choice left was total resistance. The final battle for the soul of piracy was about to begin, and it would be fought by men who had nothing left to lose except their lives. The famous last stands were over, but the war for freedom had only just begun. July 27th, 1718, Nassau Harbor. Captain Woodes Rogers stands on his quarterdeck, watching 7 British warships surround the pirate stronghold. The age of tolerance is over. Every pirate must choose, surrender and accept the king's pardon, or face the Royal Navy's guns. Most pirates choose surrender. Benjamin Hornigold, the founding father of Nassau, bows his head and accepts royal mercy. Over 300 others follow his lead. But one captain stands defiant on his deck, loading an old sloop with gunpowder, pitch, and anything that will burn. Charles Vane has made his choice. As night falls, he sets his fireship ablaze and sails it straight into Rogers' fleet, a floating inferno that illuminates Nassau Harbor like the gates of hell. Tonight, we meet the outcasts who refuse to surrender their freedom. Men whose stories reveal that the Golden Age of Piracy attracted far stranger characters than history books dare admit. A violent psychopath who terrorized even his own crew. A wealthy plantation owner who abandoned everything for a life of crime. A dandy who cared more about fashion than fighting, but whose lovers would become the most feared pirates in the Caribbean. These weren't your typical criminals. They were revolutionaries, madmen, and dreamers whose choices would prove that the human capacity for reinvention knows no bounds. The fire ship that Charles Vane launched at Woodes Rogers' fleet in July 1718 was more than just a military tactic. It was a declaration of war against civilization itself. Vane set fire to the huge French ship and sent it unmanned toward the barricade. The large fireball approaching forced Rogers and his men to pull their ships off to the side while Vane and his men boarded a smaller ship and escaped through the opening. Picture the scene: a massive vessel, fully engulfed in flames, bearing down on the British fleet like a comet from hell. Rogers' captains had never faced anything like this. It wasn't naval warfare, it was theatrical terrorism. Vane and his men then escaped in a small sloop via the harbor's narrow east entrance. The pirates had evaded the trap, but Nassau and New Providence Island were in Rogers' hands. But Vane's escape was more than just tactical success. It was proof that some men would rather die as outlaws than live as subjects. Unlike some other notable pirate captains of the age like Benjamin Hornigold and Samuel Bellamy, Vane was known for his cruelty, and in court documents is said to have beaten and interrogated sailors from ships he captured. Charles Vane represented everything dark about the pirate world that romantic legends prefer to ignore. While other captains like Henry Jennings and Benjamin Hornigold maintained code of honor and treated prisoners humanely, Vane embraced violence as both tool and entertainment. Witnesses who survived encounters with Vane's crew described systematic torture designed not just to extract information about hidden valuables, but to satisfy what seemed like genuine sadistic impulses. Vane quickly gained a reputation for cruelty and would often raid ships and torture the sailors he captured. But here's what makes Vane's story truly chilling. He was also brilliantly effective. Charles Vane led a particularly long and brutal career, operating from 1715 to 1719 and developing a reputation for violence. For 4 years, Vane terrorized shipping from the Carolinas to Honduras, capturing dozens of vessels and accumulating wealth that rivaled any pirate captain of his era. His success came from understanding something that more honorable pirates missed. Sometimes, extreme violence could be more efficient than negotiation. Ships that might have resisted Hornigold or Bellamy surrendered immediately when they spotted Vane's colors, because everyone knew that resistance meant torture, and surrender might only mean robbery. But Vane's psychopathic tendencies created a fatal weakness. Even his own crew couldn't trust him. However, Vane was not always the best leader, as he often refused to listen to his crew and let several promising ships escape. This caused Yates to take his sloop during the night with a large percentage of the treasure and leave Vane and the others. Democracy among pirates required mutual respect, shared risks, and collective decision-making. Vane's authoritarian cruelty violated every principle that held pirate crews together. When his own quartermaster, Edward Yates, staged a mutiny and sailed away with most of Vane's treasure, it proved that even among criminals, there were limits to acceptable behavior. In February 1719, Vane was caught in a storm in the Bay Islands and wrecked on a small uninhabited island, where he was eventually recognized and captured by a former pirate who had accepted the king's pardon. The irony was perfect. Charles Vane, the man who had refused all offers of mercy, was betrayed by someone who had chosen civilization over chaos. Vane was hanged in Jamaica in 1721, and even his execution revealed his character. Unlike other pirates who used their final moments to seek forgiveness or inspire followers, Vane remained defiant to the end, cursing his captors and swearing that he regretted nothing. But Charles Vane, for all his brutality, was at least comprehensible. He was a poor man who chose crime over poverty, violence over submission. The story of Major Stede Bonnet challenges every assumption about what drove men to piracy. Despite his lack of sailing experience, Bonnet decided he should turn to piracy in the spring of 1717. He bought a sailing vessel, the Revenge, and traveled with his paid crew, a retired British Army major and well-off plantation owner in Barbados. Picture this. In 1709, Bonnet married Mary Lambie, daughter of a wealthy planter. By 1715, the couple was living in the parish of St. Michael, where Bonnet held the rank of major in the militia. Stede Bonnet had everything colonial society could offer. He owned 400 acres of prime Barbadian sugar plantation. He commanded respect as a military officer. He had married into one of the island's wealthiest families. So why, in 1717, did he abandon it all to become a criminal? But in late 1716, when he was 29 years old, Bonnet decided to leave behind his plantation, his wife, and his 3 surviving children, all under the age of 5, to become a pirate, despite having no experience even captaining a ship. The historical sources hinted domestic troubles, an unhappy marriage, financial pressures, perhaps the suffocating conformity of plantation society. But none of these explain why a rational man would choose piracy over divorce, bankruptcy over crime. What makes Bonnet's case even more extraordinary is how he went about it. He bought a sailing vessel, the Revenge, and traveled with his paid crew. No other pirate in history purchased their own ship and hired their own crew. Pirates stole vessels, recruited desperate men, operated on shared risk and mutual profit. Bonnet treated piracy like a business venture, complete with startup capital and employee wages. For several months, this bizarre approach actually worked. Bonnet captured ships along the American coast, accumulated respectable treasure, and seemed to be living his dream of maritime freedom. But then he encountered Edward Teach, Blackbeard. Stede Bonnet met Blackbeard, Edward Teach, in 1717, and Teach subsequently took control of the Revenge, Bonnet's ship. What happened next reveals everything about why amateurs couldn't survive in the professional pirate world. Blackbeard, recognizing that Bonnet was completely out of his depth, simply took over. He kept Bonnet aboard as a figurehead while assuming actual command of both ships and crews. For months, Bonnet sailed with Blackbeard as little more than a passenger on his own vessel, the gentleman pirate reduced to watching real professionals operate. After Blackbeard's death in November 1718, Bonnet regained control of his ship and attempted to continue independently. But by then, the coordinated imperial campaign against piracy was reaching its peak. Finally convicted of piracy, Stede Bonnet was hanged on December 10, 1718, after less than 2 years of adventure on the high seas. Bonnet's execution was particularly tragic because it was so unnecessary. As a wealthy landowner with no previous criminal record, he could have negotiated a pardon or even returned to legitimate society. Instead, he chose death over surrender. But perhaps the most fascinating character of this era was a man who understood that piracy could be as much about style as substance. Commonly known as Calico Jack because of the colorful calico clothing that he wore, Rackham was an English pirate captain. Jack Rackham, commonly known as Calico Jack, was a pirate captain during the 18th century. He earned his name from the colorful calico clothes he wore. In an age when most pirates dressed in whatever clothes they could steal, John Calico Jack Rackham made fashion a priority. He wore bright calico fabrics, maintained careful grooming, and seemed to view piracy as much as a lifestyle choice as a criminal career. Rackham had been the quartermaster on an English warship called the Neptune under the command of Captain Vane. When Vane subsequently refused to engage a French vessel in battle, the crew was so disgusted that they mutinied and appointed Rackham as leader. This mutiny reveals something important about Rackham's character. While Charles Vane was notorious for his violence and Stede Bonnet was famous for his gentility, Calico Jack emerged as a leader through pure charisma and tactical courage. When Vane showed cowardice in the face of a French warship, Rackham stepped up, engaged the enemy, and won a decisive victory. His crew rewarded him with command, democracy in action. But Rackham's real claim to historical fame came through his romantic choices. His affair with and Bonnie scandalized Nassau society and created the pirate world's most famous love triangle when Mary Red joined their crew. She took up with the pardoned buccaneer Calico Jack Rackham, deserted her husband and went to sea with him instead. Bonnie and Red became close friends and, according to witnesses at their subsequent trial, were the fiercest. Think about what this meant. Calico Jack was the only pirate captain in history to command 2 female crew members who were among the most capable fighters in the Caribbean. While Rackham himself was competent but unremarkable as a pirate, and Bonnie and Mary Read became legendary for their ferocity in combat. Witnesses described them as more vicious in battle than any male pirate, more willing to board captured vessels, more resistant to surrender. When Captain Jonathan Barnett cornered Rackham's crew in October 1720, the contrast was stark. Most of the male crew was too drunk to fight effectively and hid below deck. Only Bonnie and Mary Read remained topside, weapons in hand, screaming at their cowardly shipmates to fight. Rackham's capture and execution demonstrated how far the pirate world had fallen from the disciplined democracy of Nassau's Golden Age. These weren't the organized, principled crews of Benjamin Hornigold or Henry Jennings. These were desperate criminals whose community had been shattered by imperial persecution. When Mary Read visited Calico Jack in his condemned cell, her words revealed the depth of her contempt for his failure. "If you had fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog." This wasn't just personal criticism, it was a condemnation of what piracy had become. The democratic ideals, the codes of honor, the mutual respect that had once bound pirate crews together had all collapsed under the pressure of systematic imperial persecution. These three men, Charles Vane, Stede Bonnet, and Calico Jack Rackham, represent the diversity and contradictions of the pirate world better than any famous captains. Vane proved that piracy could attract genuine psychopaths who used democratic principles to mask authoritarian cruelty. Bonnet demonstrated that even the wealthy and privileged could be drawn to outlaw life by forces we still don't fully understand. Rackham showed that piracy could be as much about personal style and romantic adventure as criminal profit. But their stories also reveal the fatal flaws that made the pirate republic unsustainable. Vane's cruelty violated the mutual respect that democracy required. Bonnet's amateurism proved that good intentions couldn't substitute for professional competence. Rackham's leadership failed when his crew needed courage more than charisma. By 1720, as these three men faced their various fates, execution, capture, or exile, the Golden Age of Piracy was clearly ending. The systematic imperial campaign was working. The democratic principles that had once bound pirate crews together were being corrupted by desperation and betrayal. Yet something else was emerging from the wreckage of the pirate republic. The ideas these men had lived and died for, democracy, equality, individual freedom, resistance to arbitrary authority, were taking root in unexpected places. Colonial merchants who had traded with pirates were beginning to question British tax policies. Former pirate crew members were spreading democratic ideals through port cities across the Americas. The revolutionary spirit that had animated Nassau was finding new expressions in legitimate society. The British Empire had succeeded in destroying the pirate republic, but they had also created something far more dangerous, a generation of people who had seen that alternative societies were possible, that common men could govern themselves, that authority based solely on birth and tradition could be challenged and defeated. In 50 years, these ideas would explode into the American Revolution. In a century, they would inspire democratic movements across Europe. The pirate republic was dead, but the revolution it represented was just beginning. Charles Vane had chosen violence over surrender. Stede Bonnet had chosen adventure over security. Calico Jack Rackham had chosen love over safety. Their individual choices led to individual destruction. But collectively, they had proven something that would echo through centuries, that human beings would rather die free than live as slaves. And that knowledge, once planted in human hearts, could never be destroyed. May 23, 1701. Dawn breaks over Execution Dock at Wapping, London. Captain William Kidd stands beneath the gallows, hands bound, facing the largest crowd in the dock's 400-year history. The executioner places the noose around Kidd's neck. The crowd falls silent. The trap door opens. The rope breaks. Kidd crashes to the ground, still alive, still breathing. By law, this is considered divine intervention. He could walk free. Instead, the executioner retrieves a new rope. As Kidd waits for his second attempt at death, he calls out to the crowd, "This is a very false and faithless generation." Then, looking directly at the officials who had betrayed him, he adds words that would haunt the British Empire for centuries. "My treasure lies where none but Satan and myself can find it." Tonight, we witness the systematic destruction of the pirate world. Mass executions designed to terrorize, coordinated naval campaigns that spanned 3 continents, and a mystery that would consume treasure hunters for over 3 centuries. Because when the Golden Age of Piracy ended, something else began, the greatest treasure hunt in human history. The execution of Captain Kidd wasn't just the death of one pirate. It was a public declaration that the age of tolerance was over, and the Empire would use whatever methods necessary to crush piracy forever. Execution Dock at Wapping was a performative space on the Thames River in London where pirates and other sea criminals were publicly executed by hanging. Wapping was a place where nautical justice was seen and put on display, in order to warn others of the omnipotence of the English Admiralty. But the dock's location revealed something significant about imperial psychology. The dock symbolized that jurisdiction by being located just beyond the low tide mark in the river. This wasn't just about punishment. This was about demonstrating that British law extended to every corner of the maritime world. Pirates meeting their gruesome end on the gallows at Execution Dock were allegedly subject to an unusual hanging. The rope was too short to break the neck on the drop, so the condemned would be strangled, appearing to dance as their limbs twitched as they died. This dancing wasn't accidental. It was designed to maximize terror, to create a spectacle so horrifying that no sailor would ever consider joining a pirate crew. But London wasn't the only place where imperial justice was being demonstrated with theatrical brutality. In Port Royal, Jamaica, the former pirate haven that had been destroyed by earthquake and rebuilt as a symbol of legitimate authority, gallows were erected with systematic precision. Every captured pirate crew faced the same fate: public trial, inevitable conviction, and execution designed to send messages across the Caribbean network. The difference was that Caribbean executions served multiple purposes. They terrorized potential pirates, demonstrated imperial power to colonial populations, and provided opportunities for officials to display captured treasure as evidence of successful law enforcement. Picture the scene: dozens of chests filled with pieces of 8, gold bars, precious stones, and exotic goods from around the world, displayed in public squares before cheering crowds. Colonial governors would make speeches about the triumph of law over chaos, order over anarchy. But there was something the officials never mentioned in these celebrations. The captured treasure represented only a fraction of what the pirates had actually stolen. Where was the rest? By 1720, as the systematic campaign against piracy reached its peak, a disturbing pattern emerged in interrogation records. Captured pirates consistently claimed that the greatest treasures had been hidden, buried, or deposited in secret locations known only to their captains. Thomas Davis, a member of Bartholomew Roberts' crew captured in 1722, told his interrogators about treasure caches worth millions of pieces of 8 hidden throughout the Caribbean. But when pressed for locations, he claimed only Roberts himself knew the precise coordinates. Roberts was already dead. John Phillips, captured the same year, spoke of the Great Account, a master list of treasure locations maintained by the most successful pirate captains. But Phillips died during his capture, taking his knowledge with him. Pattern after pattern revealed the same maddening reality. The systematic campaign to destroy piracy was succeeding, but it was also ensuring that pirate treasure would remain hidden forever. By 1722, the imperial response to piracy had evolved into something unprecedented in maritime history: a coordinated international police action. British, Spanish, French, and Dutch naval forces were sharing intelligence, coordinating patrols, and conducting joint operations across the Atlantic. Traditional enemies had united against what they now recognized as an existential threat to colonial authority. This coordination produced devastating results. In 1722 alone, over 200 pirates were executed in various locations throughout the Americas. Entire crews were wiped out. Ships were burned or converted to naval use. The infrastructure that had supported the pirate republic was systematically dismantled. But the most significant development was psychological. The empire had learned to use pirates on democratic principles against them. Every captured pirate was offered the same choice that had destroyed Nassau: accept a pardon and help hunt your former allies, or face certain execution. The response split pirate crews in ways that made effective resistance impossible. Men who had once voted together in pirate assemblies now testified against each other in imperial courts. Democratic captains found their own crews willing to betray them for promises of clemency. The pirate code that had once bound these men together through shared risk and mutual respect was disintegrating under the pressure of imperial persecution. Yet even as the last pirate strongholds fell and the final crews were captured, something else was happening that would ensure piracy's immortality: the creation of legends that would outlive the men who inspired them. Every execution created martyrs. Every display of captured treasure sparked dreams of hidden hoards. Every official claim that piracy had been crushed forever only emphasized how recently it had seemed unstoppable. The stories began immediately. Sailors in legitimate service spread tales of democratic pirate societies where common men had lived like kings. Former pirates who had accepted pardons whispered about treasure locations they claimed to remember but could never quite locate. According to the earliest hypothesis, the pit held a pirate treasure buried by Captain Kidd. Kidd and Henry Avery reportedly took treasure together, and Oak Island was their community bank. Another pirate story involved Edward Teach, Blackbeard, who said that he buried his treasure where none but Satan and myself can find it. Think about what these treasure stories represented. They weren't just about money. They were about the persistent belief that somewhere, hidden away from imperial authority, the wealth and freedom of the pirate age still existed. By the mid-1920s, over a half-dozen different organized attempts had failed to produce kids' treasure. These attempts came at both a financial and human cost, over $100,000, $1.5 million today, spent in 2 lives lost. The hunt for pirate treasure became an obsession that would span centuries, consuming fortunes and lives in pursuit of wealth that might never have existed. But the real treasure that pirates left behind wasn't gold or silver. It was something far more valuable and far more dangerous, proof that alternative societies were possible. By 1725, official reports declared that organized piracy had been eliminated from Atlantic shipping lanes. The last major pirate captain, Bartholomew Roberts, was dead. Nassau had been transformed into a legitimate British colony. The democratic principles that had governed pirate society had been replaced by traditional imperial hierarchy. Mission accomplished. Or was it? Because while the British Empire was congratulating itself on destroying piracy, something else was happening in the American colonies that suggested the pirate revolution had not been crushed, it had evolved. In Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, colonial merchants and politicians were beginning to question British authority in ways that sounded remarkably familiar to anyone who had studied pirate democracy. They spoke of taxation without representation, the same complaint pirates had made about merchant captains who claimed all profits while crews did all the work. They organized boycotts of British goods, the same economic warfare tactics pirates had used against Spanish treasure fleets. They formed committees of correspondence, democratic organizations that coordinated resistance across colonial boundaries, just like the pirate councils that had once governed Nassau. The American Revolution was still 50 years away, but its intellectual foundations were being laid by men who had watched the pirate experiment with fascination and horror. Benjamin Franklin had grown up hearing stories of pirate democracy. Thomas Paine had worked in ports where former pirates shared tales of their adventures. John Adams had witnessed the trials of captured pirates and been impressed by their dignity in the face of imperial justice. When these men eventually declared independence from Britain, they would create a democratic republic based on principles that sounded suspiciously familiar to anyone who remembered the pirate codes of Nassau. But there was another legacy of the pirate age that would prove even more enduring: the mystery. Bellamont supposedly stated that he had bid the Gaylor to try if he could prevail with Captain Kidd to discover where his treasure was, but he said nobody could find it but himself and would not tell any further. Every major pirate captain who faced execution took their secrets to the grave. Every captured treasure represented only a fraction of what had been accumulated during the Golden Age. If treasure really is at the bottom of the money pit, no one has found it yet, but one thing is for sure: people love a good legend. More than 50 books have been written on the subject. 3 centuries later, the search continues. Modern technology has replaced simple shovels and maps, but the obsession remains the same. Somewhere out there, the wealth of the pirate age waits to be discovered. Yet perhaps the real treasure was never gold or silver at all. Perhaps it was the knowledge that a handful of sailors and outcasts had proven something that every empire wanted to deny: that ordinary people could govern themselves, create equitable societies, and challenge the fundamental assumptions about authority that seemed carved in stone. The Golden Age of Piracy ended with systematic executions, coordinated naval campaigns, and the triumph of imperial authority over democratic rebellion. But endings, as any pirate would tell you, are also beginnings. The ideas that drove men to raise black flags and vote on democratic crews didn't die at Execution Dock or in the prisons of Port Royal. They spread through colonial society like seeds carried on Atlantic winds, taking root in unexpected places and growing into something that would ultimately prove more dangerous to empires than any pirate fleet. 50 years after the last pirate captain was hanged, colonial rebels would raise their own flags of resistance and declare their independence from the same imperial system that had crushed the pirate republic. They would create democratic institutions that looked remarkably similar to pirate codes. They would establish principles of equality and representation that echoed through Nassau's taverns. They would prove that the pirate revolution had not been defeated. It had simply changed flags. The Golden Age of Piracy was over, but the age of democratic revolution was just beginning. And somewhere out there, in the waters where pirates once roamed free, their treasure still waits to be found. Not gold or silver, but something far more valuable. The proof that freedom is always possible if you're brave enough to seize it. When most people think pirates, they imagine sun-soaked Caribbean islands and Spanish treasure galleons. But that's only one chapter in a much larger story. By 1690, piracy had exploded across the globe like wildfire, establishing strongholds on 3 different continents. The numbers are staggering. While a few hundred pirates terrorized the Caribbean, over 2,000 seasoned raiders had made Madagascar their home base. The Indian Ocean had become their personal hunting ground, where a single successful raid could net more gold than 10 Caribbean ventures combined. Henry Every knew this when he sailed his ship, the Fancy, into Nassau Harbor in 1696. The era of piracy in the Bahamas began in 1696, when the privateer Henry Every brought his ship, the Fancy, loaded with loot from plundering Indian trade ships into Nassau Harbor. But Every wasn't just carrying Caribbean plunder. His hold was bursting with treasure from the Mughal Empire, wealth beyond imagination. This single moment marked the beginning of something unprecedented, a global pirate economy. Let's start with the most infamous pirate haven of them all, Port Royal, Jamaica, a name that sent shivers down the spines of merchants across 2 hemispheres. By the 1660s, this Caribbean port had earned a reputation that would make modern Las Vegas look like a Sunday school picnic. This pirate haven earned its nickname, the wickedest city on earth, where the usual rules of society were drowned in greed and rum. Picture the scene: taverns that never close, brothels on every corner, and enough flowing rum to float a frigate. Pirates would stagger through muddy streets with pockets full of Spanish gold, spending their fortunes faster than they'd stolen them. But Port Royal wasn't just about debauchery, it was a sophisticated operation. The English government had essentially legalized piracy here, issuing letters of marque that transformed pirates into privateers. Henry Morgan, the most famous of these legal pirates, used Port Royal as his headquarters for raids that brought millions in Spanish treasure back to English coffers. The irony? In 1687, Jamaica passed anti-piracy laws. Consequently, instead of being a safe haven for pirates, Port Royal became noted as their place of execution. The very city that had sheltered pirates for decades suddenly turned against them. Then came June 7, 1692. In 3 minutes, a massive earthquake and tsunami swallowed 2/3 of Port Royal beneath the waves. Merchants, pirates, and prostitutes alike were buried under tons of Caribbean water. Many saw it as divine judgment on the Sodom of the New World. With Port Royal in ruins, the pirates needed a new home. Benjamin Hornigold had the answer: the Bahamas. A new base was needed, and Hornigold immediately suggested the Bahamas, littered with islands, shoals, and anchorages perfect for refueling or setting up ambushes. Nassau became more than just a pirate haven. It evolved into something resembling a functioning republic. The famous flying gang established their own codes of conduct, elected their own leaders, and created what historians now call the Republic of Pirates. The Golden Age of Piracy lasted for 30 years, from 1690 to 1720, and Nassau was at its heart. This wasn't just a collection of random outlaws. It was an organized society with its own rules, its own democracy, and its own unique culture. The most legendary figures of piracy called Nassau home: Blackbeard, Charles Vane, Calico Jack Rackham, and Bonny. They didn't just raid ships. They created a functioning alternative society that challenged the very foundations of European colonial power. But Nassau's days were numbered. In 1718, Woodes Rogers arrived as a new governor with a royal pardon in one hand and a loaded cannon in the other. His message was simple: accept the pardon or face the gallows. Now we travel halfway around the world to Madagascar, where the most extraordinary pirate story of all was unfolding. This massive island of the African coast had everything pirates could dream of: hidden harbors, friendly locals, abundant fresh water, and, most importantly, it sat directly in the path of the world's richest trade routes. At the time, the Indian Ocean was mostly ruled by the Mughal Empire and various European trading companies, making it a target-rich environment for enterprising pirates. But Madagascar offered something even more valuable than strategic location: the chance to disappear entirely. French privateers, who preyed on ships sailing the Red Sea, first used it as a base of operations sometime before 1614. By the 1690s, entire pirate communities had established themselves along the coast. Thomas Chew made Madagascar famous among pirates when he returned to America with stories of unprecedented riches. A single voyage to the Indian Ocean could yield more treasure than years of Caribbean raiding. Soon, Pirates were abandoning the Caribbean in droves, seeking their fortunes in the waters of Africa and India. Here's where our story takes an extraordinary turn. Deep in Madagascar's northern coast, in a bay called Diego Suarez, something remarkable supposedly happened. The two ships arrived in Diego Suarez around 1685 or 1690. The archives have disappeared, and only through the reports of surviving sailors could this story be attributed to the years 1685 to 1690. According to historical accounts, a French pirate named James Misson and his crew didn't just establish another pirate haven. They created something unprecedented in human history, a truly egalitarian society called Libertalia. The pirates in this colony became farmers and married native women. They also freed many African, Indian, and Arabian slaves, who they encouraged to join their society. This wasn't just about treasure anymore. It was about creating a utopian society where race, religion, and nationality didn't matter. These pirates who settled in Libertalia would be vigilant guardians of the people's rights and liberties. They would stand as barriers against the rich and powerful of their day. Imagine society in the 1690s, 2 centuries before the abolition of slavery, where former slaves, indigenous peoples, and European pirates lived as equals, where decisions were made democratically, where wealth was shared communally, and where religious freedom was absolute. For 25 years, Libertalia allegedly thrived. It had its own constitution, its own laws, and its own fleet of ships that flew a white flag instead of the traditional black. They called themselves Liberi, the free ones. But here's a question that has haunted historians for 3 centuries. Did Libertalia actually exist? The main source of Libertalia is Volume 2 of A General History of the Pirates, a 1724 book which describes Captain Misson and Libertalia. This is the same book that gave us many of our most famous pirate legends. But Captain Johnson's book mixed fact with fiction so thoroughly that separating truth from myth has become nearly impossible. Some historians have expressed doubts over its existence outside of literature. No archaeological evidence has ever been found. No official records exist. The only proof comes from pirate accounts, hardly the most reliable sources. Yet the details are remarkably specific. The archives have disappeared, and only through the accounts of surviving sailors could this story be pieced together. Why would pirates invent such an elaborate hoax about a democratic, anti-slavery republic when such ideas were radical even by today's standards? Whether Libertalia was real or imaginary, it represents something crucial about the Golden Age of Piracy. These weren't just random criminals. They were part of a global network that stretched from Bahamas to Madagascar, connected by shared codes, similar values, and a common enemy, the emerging world of European empires and global capitalism. These pirate strongholds weren't isolated outposts. They were nodes in a communication network that spanned oceans. Pirates regularly traveled between Nassau and Madagascar, sharing information about trade routes, naval movements, and political developments. They had their own intelligence network that often outperformed official government sources. The diversity was remarkable. In Nassau, you'd find English, French, and Spanish pirates working together. In Madagascar, European pirates married African and Malagasy women, creating mixed communities that challenged every social norm of the era. Port Royal had been a melting pot of nationalities, religions, and races united only by the pursuit of Spanish gold. But the global empires were learning to fight back. The same naval technology that had enabled global piracy was being turned against the pirates themselves. Coordinated campaigns began targeting pirate strongholds simultaneously across the world. In 1718, Woodes Rogers pacified Nassau. By 1720, the Royal Navy had systematically destroyed pirate bases throughout the Caribbean. Madagascar proved more resilient. But even there, changing political alliances with local kingdoms eventually undermined pirate operations. The Golden Age was ending not with a single great battle, but with a slow strangulation of the global network that had made it possible. Today, Port Royal lies mostly underwater, its pirate treasures buried beneath centuries of Caribbean sediment. Nassau had become a tourist destination where cruise ship passengers pose with actors dressed as Blackbeard. Madagascar's pirate bases have been reclaimed by jungle and time, but the questions remain. In our age of global networks and digital communities, the pirate strongholds offer a fascinating glimpse into an early experiment in international cooperation, one built on shared rebellion against established authority. Did pirates really create functioning alternative societies? Was Libertalia a historical reality or an impossible dream? Could outlaws from different continents really unite around common values of freedom and equality? What do you think? Was Libertalia real or just pirate propaganda? Drop your theories in the comments. Which pirate stronghold would you have chosen? The party atmosphere of Port Royal, the democracy of Nassau, or the mysterious freedom of Madagascar? A poll. Which pirate haven sounds most appealing to you? July 26, 1718. Dawn breaks over Nassau Harbor as 7 British warships emerge from the morning mist like harbingers of judgment. On the deck of the lead vessel stands a man whose face bears the scars of war and whose eyes hold the determination of empire itself. Captain Woodes Rogers has arrived in paradise and has brought hell with him. In his hand, he clutches 2 documents that will determine the fate of every soul on the island. One offers redemption, the other promises death. The pirates of Nassau have a choice to make, and they have exactly 60 seconds to decide. This is the moment the Golden Age of Piracy begins to die. On July 25, 1718, Woodes Rogers arrived at Nassau Harbor with a mandate that would forever change the Caribbean. He wasn't just another colonial administrator. He was a battle-tested privateer who had circumnavigated the globe, captured Spanish treasure ships worth millions, and rescued Alexander Selkirk, the real-life Robinson Crusoe, from a deserted island. Rogers had seen the world's oceans and understood better than any man alive how piracy threatened the very foundations of global trade. Now King George had given him unlimited authority to end the pirate Republic of Nassau by any means necessary. The moment Rogers stepped onto Nassau's sun-bleached docks, he surveyed a scene that would have shocked civilized Europe. Makeshift taverns lined streets filled with armed men from a dozen nations. African, European, and Caribbean women moved freely among crews that had abandoned the racial hierarchies of the outside world. Ships flew flags of convenience, their holds still warm with stolen Spanish gold. This was the beating heart of the Pirate Republic, a functioning alternative society that had thrived for nearly 3 decades. Rogers had come to destroy it all. Rogers understood that brute force alone couldn't destroy Nassau. The island's shallow waters and hidden channels gave pirates every advantage. So he deployed a weapon far more powerful than cannons, psychology. The Act of Grace, issued by King George on September 5, 1717, decreed that any pirate who surrendered to a British governor within 1 year would be pardoned for all piracies committed before January 5, 1718. Rogers carried hundreds of these pardons with him, official documents that could transform wanted criminals into free men with a stroke of a pen. The terms were deceptively simple. Surrender your weapons, abandon your crew, renounce piracy forever, and the crown would forgive everything. No trials, no executions, no questions asked about the mountains of stolen treasure already spent. It was a deal of a lifetime. But there was a catch. Pirates had to give up their plunder as a condition of the pardon. For men who had spent years accumulating wealth beyond imagination, this felt like signing their own death warrants. The psychological warfare was immediate and devastating. Within hours of Rogers' arrival, Nassau's pirate community began to fracture along lines that had never existed before. Brothers in arms found themselves on opposite sides of an impossible decision, freedom or fortune. At a great assembly of pirates, Captain Benjamin Hornigold spoke in favor of the pardon, while Captain Charles Vane spoke against it. The pirates could not agree, and so the meeting broke up. Picture this scene. Nassau's greatest captains gathered in a smoke-filled tavern, their futures hanging in the balance. Benjamin Hornigold, the mentor who had taught Blackbeard everything he knew about piracy, stood before his peers and urged them to accept Rogers' offer. The irony was staggering. The man who had helped create the Republic of Pirates was now advocating for its peaceful surrender. Hornigold's logic was ruthless in its clarity. The age of piracy was ending whether they liked it or not. European navies were growing stronger, trade routes more heavily protected, and colonial governments more organized. They could surrender with dignity and keep their lives, or fight and lose everything. Charles Vane saw it differently. To him, the pardon was a trap designed to eliminate piracy without the messy business of actual battles. Why should free men bow to distant kings who had never seen the Caribbean sun or felt the weight of honest plunder in their hands? The meeting that night tore the pirate brotherhood apart. Vane declined a pardon from Governor Rogers and began recruiting men who shared his defiance. Vane found he had lost many men who hoped for the pardon, so he went out recruiting new men for the several ships he commands. Rogers' strategy worked with frightening efficiency. Many pirates did indeed take up the offer of a pardon in 1718, but their stories reveal the complex psychology of men choosing between loyalty and survival. John took a pardon for his pirate crimes, once in early 1718 and again in May of 1719 through direct appeal to Governor Rogers. John plied the plunder he gained from his previous pirate cruises, but soon expended all his money, forcing him to join privateering operations under British authority. The transformation was remarkable and disturbing. Pirates who had spent years fighting European authority now found themselves working for it. Hornigold became one of Rogers' most effective pirate hunters, using his intimate knowledge of pirate tactics to track down his former allies. But taking the pardon didn't guarantee safety. 8 previously pardoned prisoners, including Auger and McCarthy, would be hanged at December after being caught returning to piracy. Rogers' message was clear. The pardon was a one-time offer with no second chances. Rogers arrived on July 22, 1718, and blockaded the port, trapping Charles Vane in the harbor. Vane's ship was too large to pass one entrance, and the other was blocked by Rogers' fleet. Charles Vane refused to go quietly. Trapped in Nassau Harbor with no escape route, he made a decision that epitomized a pirate spirit. If he couldn't run, he'd fight his way out in the most spectacular fashion possible. In a final act of defiance, Vane launched a daring assault at the blockade involving a captured French vessel as a fire ship in an attempt to ram the naval vessels. Picture the scene. A burning ship loaded with gunpowder sailing straight toward Rogers' flagship in the dead of night. Flames leaping into the Caribbean sky like a funeral pyre for the age of piracy itself. The attempt failed, but the naval vessels were forced out of position, giving Vane the opening he needed. In the chaos and smoke, he slipped past Rogers' blockade and escaped into the open ocean, carrying with him the hopes of every pirate who refused to surrender. Rogers had won the battle for Nassau, but Vane's dramatic escape proved that the war was far from over. With Nassau secured, Rogers transformed the pirate hunters from hunted to hunters. Benjamin Hornigold, now under Rogers' employ, was sent to pursue Charles Vane, creating one of history's most bitter manhunts, mentor hunting student, friend tracking former ally. The pursuit of Charles Vane became the template for the global campaign against piracy. Rogers established a network of informants, bounty hunters, and reformed pirates who knew every hiding spot, every safe harbor, every trick in the pirate playbook. By the end of November 1718, the pirate hunters had captured more than 10 prisoners, including Nicholas Woodall. The speed was breathtaking. Within months of Rogers' arrival, the most notorious pirates in the Caribbean were either pardoned, captured, or fleeing for their lives. But Vane remained free, and his continued defiance inspired other holdouts. Edward Teach, Blackbeard, continued terrorizing the Carolina coast. Calico Jack Rackham gathered crew that included history's most famous female pirates. The Republic of Nassau had fallen, but the spirit of piracy lived on in scattered cells across the Atlantic world. Why did some pirates accept a pardon while others chose certain death over submission? The answer reveals the complex motivations that drove men to piracy in the first place. For many, piracy had been an economic choice, the fastest route from poverty to wealth in a world that offered few alternatives. When Rogers offered them a chance to keep their lives and start fresh, the calculation was simple. Better to be a poor free man than a rich dead one. But for others, piracy represented something deeper, a complete rejection of the social order that had denied them opportunity, respect, and dignity. Charles Vane wasn't just fighting for treasure. He was fighting for the right to exist outside the systems of authority that had shaped European colonial society. The pardoned pirates faced a cruel irony. They had gained their freedom but lost their identity. What was a pirate without piracy? Many struggled with the transition, finding themselves adrift in a world that would never fully accept them. Here's where our story takes its most mysterious turn. Rogers granted the king's pardon to those former pirates on the island who had not yet accepted it, but the historical record shows something strange. Many of these pardoned pirates simply disappeared. Official documents showed dozens of pirates accepting pardons and promising to abandon their criminal ways. But within months, many of these men had vanished without a trace. They weren't captured, they weren't executed, and they didn't return to their home countries. They simply ceased to exist in any official capacity. Some historians suggest they changed their names and integrated into colonial society. Others believe they joined legitimate merchant crews or privateering expeditions. But a darker theory suggests something else entirely, that many pardoned pirates never intended to honor their agreements at all. The most chilling possibility of all, what if the king's pardon was never meant to end piracy, but to transform it? Consider the evidence. By the end of the 1720s, piracy was gone for good, not just reduced, but completely eliminated from the Caribbean. This wasn't just a result of military action. It was a result of systematic conversion of pirates into assets of the British Empire. Rogers didn't just pardon pirates. He recruited them. The same men who had terrorized Spanish shipping were now protecting British trade routes. The same crews who had raided colonial ports were now defending them against foreign attack. The British Empire had effectively weaponized a pirate network against its rivals. But here's a question that haunts historians. Did the pardoned pirates truly reform, or did they simply transfer their allegiance? Were they former criminals seeking redemption, or were they double agents working for the crown while maintaining their old connections and skills? Charles Vane's capture came not through Rogers' systematic campaign, but through a stroke of pure chance. Shipwrecked on a remote island, Vane was recognized by a former pirate associate who had taken Rogers' pardon. The man who had defied the British Empire was finally brought to justice by his own former ally. Vane's execution in 1721 marked the end of an era. He went to his death unrepentant, refusing to name accomplices or reveal hidden treasures. His final words reportedly expressed no regret for his choices, only contempt for those who had surrendered their freedom for the promise of safety. By the end of the 1720s, piracy was gone for good from the Caribbean, but Rogers' victory came at a price that history has only begun to understand. The systematic dismantling of the pirate republic had scattered hundreds of experienced raiders across the Atlantic world. Some became merchants, others joined colonial militias, and many simply vanished into history. The pardoned pirates had been absorbed into the British Empire, but their skills, their connections, and their knowledge of the seas remained intact. They knew every smuggling route, every corrupt official, every weakness in the colonial defense system. They had become, in essence, a ghost fleet operating within the legal framework of imperial authority. Would you have taken the king's pardon? Drop your choice in the comments, freedom or fortune. A poll. Which pirate made the right choice? Hornigold who lived, or Vane who died free? What do you think happened to all those pardoned pirates who vanished? Conspiracy theories welcome. Fun fact. Some of your ancestors might have been pardoned pirates who changed their names. Anyone want to share family legends? London, 1720. The Thames runs black under a grey October sky. Along the muddy banks of Wapping, a forest of iron cages sways in the morning breeze, each one containing the rotting remains of pirate. Their crimes are written on wooden placards beneath their feet. Their skulls grin at passing merchant ships like grotesque lighthouse beacons warning, "This is what happens to those who defy the crown." The Golden Age of Piracy isn't ending with epic battles or heroic last stands. It's ending with mass executions, systematic terror, and the slow, methodical crushing of every dream the pirates ever dared to dream. Execution Dock at Wapping stood just beyond the low tide mark on the River Thames, symbolizing the British Admiralty's jurisdiction over all crimes committed at sea. For over 400 years, this modest wooden scaffold would serve as the final destination for pirates, smugglers, and mutineers from around the world. But in the 1720s, Execution Dock became something far more terrifying, the epic end of an industrial-scale campaign of terror designed to end piracy forever. The hanging process itself was deliberately designed for maximum suffering. Pirates were executed using shortened ropes that provided insufficient drop to break the neck, forcing them to die from prolonged suffocation while their limbs spasmed in agony. Picture the scene. Crowds of thousands gathering at dawn to watch condemned pirates mount the scaffold. Street vendors selling pies and ale as entertainment. Children perched on their fathers' shoulders to get a better view of justice. The condemned men, many barely out of their teens, facing death for the crime of seeking freedom on the open seas. After execution, the horror continued. Bodies were chained to stakes at low water mark and left until 3 high tides had washed over them. Some were then gibbeted for extended periods along the river or coastline as warnings to others. Bodies were sometimes coated in tar, bound in chains to prolong the public display, with some placed in body-shaped iron cages to contain the decomposing corpses. The psychological impact was devastating. Every sailor entering London's harbour was forced to navigate past dozens of rotting pirate corpses, each one a reminder of the price of rebellion. The executions weren't limited to London. From Port Royal to Boston, from Charleston to Nassau, colonial governments launched coordinated campaigns to eliminate piracy through systematic terror. The numbers tell the story. In 1723 alone, over 200 pirates were executed across British territories. By 1730, an estimated 400 to 500 pirates had been hanged, gibbeted, or shot in what historians now recognize as one of history's first global law enforcement campaigns. The trials themselves became theatrical productions designed to reinforce imperial authority. Colonial newspapers published detailed accounts of pirates' final confessions, their expressions of regret, and their warnings to other potential criminals. But behind the public spectacle lay a more complex reality. Many of the executed pirates were former privateers who had served the crown faithfully during wartime, only to find themselves criminalized when peace returned and their services were no longer needed. The same skills that had made them valuable assets in war now made them dangerous liabilities in peace. The systematic destruction of piracy wasn't achieved through executions alone. The 1720s marked a revolutionary transformation in naval power that made piracy virtually impossible. British naval technology had evolved dramatically since the 1690s. New ship designs, improved navigation techniques, and coordinated fleet tactics gave naval vessels overwhelming advantages over traditional pirate ships. Pirates who had once outmaneuvered cumbersome warships now found themselves outgunned, outmanned, and outmaneuvered. The establishment of permanent naval stations throughout the Caribbean created a surveillance network that made surprise attacks nearly impossible. Every island, every cove, every traditional hiding spot was now monitored by government agents and naval patrols. Most crucially, the economic foundations of piracy had shifted. The Spanish treasure fleets that had provided pirates with their richest targets were now heavily escorted by warships. Trade routes were reorganized to minimize vulnerability. Insurance companies began offering rewards for pirate captures that exceeded the value of most raids. As the last pirates faced execution, a new legend began to emerge, the myth of hidden treasure. The belief that Captain Kidd had left buried treasure contributed greatly to the growth of his legend, inspiring numerous treasure hunts on Oak Island in Nova Scotia, Suffolk County, Long Island, Charles Island in Connecticut, and other locations. Edward Teach, Blackbeard, reportedly said he buried his treasure where none but Satan and myself can find it. These tantalizing hints of hidden wealth captured public imagination in ways that the pirates themselves never had. The reality was more mundane. Most pirates spent their plunder as quickly as they acquired it. The communal lifestyle of pirate crews meant that wealth was shared immediately rather than hoarded for future use. Archaeological evidence suggests that very little pirate treasure was ever actually buried. Captain Kidd did bury a cache of treasure in Cherry Tree Field on Gardiner's Island, but it was found and sent to courts in England as evidence against him. The most enduring legend centers on Oak Island, Nova Scotia, where treasure hunters have spent over $100,000, equivalent to $1.5 million today, and lost multiple lives searching for Kidd's supposed treasure. By the mid-1920s, over half a dozen organized attempts had failed to produce any treasure, at both financial and human cost. Even as a noose tightened around organized piracy, scattered crews continued operating in remote waters. The Indian Ocean remained a haven for die-hard pirates well into the 1730s. Madagascar's complex political landscape provided refuge for small-scale raiders who preyed on local shipping. But these final pirates were shadows of their Golden Age predecessors. Without the organized networks, safe harbors, and massive crews of earlier decades, they posed little threat to global commerce. Most were eventually captured or killed by local authorities, their deaths meriting barely a paragraph in colonial newspapers. The transformation was complete. What had once been a global movement involving thousands of participants had been reduced to scattered bands of desperate criminals operating on society's margins. By 1730, something unprecedented had occurred in human history. An entire criminal enterprise had been completely eliminated through systematic enforcement. The seas that had once swarmed with pirate ships now carried legitimate commerce under the protection of professional navies. The silence was more profound than anyone could have imagined. For 30 years, the sound of cannon fire and the sight of black flags had been constants in maritime life. Suddenly, they were gone. An entire way of life, with its own codes, its own communities, its own culture, had simply vanished. The fall of piracy left behind more questions than answers. What happened to the thousands of pirates who simply disappeared from historical records? Where did their accumulated wealth actually go? Most mysteriously, what happened to the knowledge they had acquired, the detailed maps, the intelligence networks, the understanding of global trade routes that had made their success possible? The Oak Island mystery continues to this day, with over 50 books written on the subject and millions of dollars spent on excavations, though geological evidence suggests the money pit may be a natural formation rather than a human-made treasure vault. As we close this chapter of maritime history, one question echoes across the centuries. Is some of it still out there? Not just the gold and silver that captured headlines, but the real treasure, the maps showing secret harbors, the records of corrupt officials, the detailed intelligence about colonial defenses that took decades to compile, knowledge that could rewrite our understanding of early global commerce. In maritime museums around the world, curators occasionally discover mysterious charts and the personal effects of deceased sailors, maps showing islands that don't appear in official records, detailed drawings of coastlines that were supposedly unexplored, coded logs that no one has ever been able to decipher. The pirates may be gone, but their secrets remain buried somewhere in the vast expanse of our oceans. Underscore 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 underscore. The executioner's rope ended the golden age of piracy, but it could not kill the stories. In fact, it was only the beginning of a legend that would prove far more powerful than the pirates themselves ever were. Within months of the last mass execution, practically every pirate stereotype comes from this novel. Buried treasure, maps where X literally marks the spot, mutiny, and drunk pirates. For over a century, Treasure Island's timeless storytelling has enchanted readers and ignited imaginations with its gripping tale of pirates, buried treasure, and daring heroics. Stevenson had never been a pirate. He had never even seen the Caribbean. But as fictional Long John Silver, Jim Hawkins, and Captain Flint became more real to most people than the actual historical pirates whose names fill court records and execution logs. While the novel certainly influenced the way we think of pirates, and especially their presumed proclivity for burying treasure and marking it on secret maps, it was a 1950 movie adaptation that truly cemented these images in popular consciousness. The 20th century transformed pirates from literary characters into global icons. Hollywood discovered that pirate stories offer the perfect combination of adventure, romance, and rebellion that audiences craved. Errol Flynn's swashbuckling Captain Blood established a template: handsome, charismatic rogues who fought corrupt authority with wit and sword. These movie pirates bore no resemblance to the desperate criminals who had actually terrorized shipping lanes. They were fantasy figures designed to let audiences experience vicarious freedom. Disney's theme park attractions turned piracy into family entertainment, complete with singing animatronic pirates and treasure-hunting adventures suitable for children. The Pirates of the Caribbean franchise generated billions of dollars in revenue, making Johnny Depp's Captain Jack Sparrow more famous than any actual historical pirate. Perhaps nowhere is a transformation more complete than in the modern Halloween costume aisle. Every October, millions of children and adults dress as pirates, complete with our patches, wooden legs, and plastic cutlasses. They shout "Ahoy matey" and "Shiver me timbers," phrases that would have been meaningless to actual 18th century pirates. Robert Louis Stevenson's classic codified the language of pirates that remains a staple of pop culture. The real pirates spoke the nautical English of their time, peppered with Spanish, French, and African words picked up in ports around the world. The theatrical pirate dialect we associate with them today is pure invention. This cultural transformation reveals something profound about human nature. We have taken a brutal criminal enterprise built on violence, theft, and terror, and transformed it into a symbol of childhood adventure and romantic freedom. The same generation that will be horrified by modern maritime piracy cheerfully celebrates its historical predecessor. But beneath the Hollywood glamour and Halloween costumes lies a more complex legacy that continues to resonate today. The Pirate Republic of Nassau represented one of history's earliest experiments in radical democracy. Their codes of conduct anticipated modern concepts of workers' rights and social insurance by centuries. The diverse communities that developed in pirate strongholds challenged racial and national hierarchies that dominated European colonial society. In a world rigidly divided by class, religion, and ethnicity, pirate crews created spaces where merit and courage mattered more than birthright. Modern maritime law, international waters, and concept of freedom of navigation all bear traces of principles that pirates helped establish through their defiance of imperial monopolies. The very idea that the seas should be free for all nations to navigate emerged partly from pirate challenges to Spanish and Portuguese claims of oceanic sovereignty. As we reach the end of our journey through the Golden Age of Piracy, we're left with questions that transcend historical curiosity. In our interconnected world of global commerce and digital communication, what can we learn from people who chose to live completely outside the system? The pirates understood something about freedom that we perhaps forgotten, that true liberty sometimes requires a willingness to abandon everything: home, family, social approval, personal safety, in pursuit of something greater than individual comfort. They also understood the price of that freedom. Most pirates died young, poor, and far from home. Their communities were often violent, unstable, and short-lived. The romantic image obscures a reality that piracy offered brief moments of freedom purchased at the cost of almost certain early death. The waves that once carried pirate ships still roll across the same seas today. In the Caribbean, gentle trade winds whisper through palm trees that may have sheltered pirates 3 centuries ago. The sun sets over waters that once reflected black flags and blazed with cannon fire. But the pirates themselves have become something more than history. They become mythology, stories we tell ourselves about the possibility of absolute freedom, the romance of rebellion, and the price of choosing adventure over security. Perhaps that's their greatest treasure of all, not the gold and silver they buried on forgotten islands, but the dreams they planted in human imagination, dreams that refuse to stay buried, no matter how many centuries pass. In the end, the Golden Age of Piracy lasted barely 30 years. But its echoes remain forever, carried on every tide, whispered in every wind, alive in every heart that has ever looked at the horizon and wondered what lies beyond the edge of the known world. The waves roll on, carrying whispers of the past. Though the Golden Age ended, its stories sail on through eternity, as immortal as the sea itself. Before you go, I want to hear from you. Do you think these pirates were freedom fighters carving out their own republic, or were they nothing more than ruthless criminals? Leave your thoughts below. I read every single comment, and your theory might appear in the next documentary. And if this story pulled you in, then imagine what's still ahead. We're only scratching the surface of lost treasure, vanishing ships, and legends that refuse to die. So hit that like button. It tells YouTube to push this void to others who love forgotten history. Subscribe with the bell turned on, because the next chapter is darker, stranger, and even more mysterious than this one. This sea doesn't rest, and neither do the stories waiting beneath the waves.